I have been asked more than once how a man like Callum Ashford, the Duke of Havenmore, the most feared peer in 3 counties, a man who could silence a ballroom simply by walking into it, could have been undone by a woman who poured his morning tea. My answer is always the same. He was not undone in a single moment. He was undone across 10 years of mornings, 1 cup at a time, 1 fire built before it was asked for, 1 lamp checked in the dark hours of a sleepless night. He was undone by accumulation, by the slow, invisible arithmetic of small things done with care. My name is Edmund Wexford. I was Havenmore's closest friend for the better part of 20 years. His only real friend, if I am honest about it, since the grief had stripped him of the sociable kind. I was present for most of what I am about to tell you. What I did not witness directly, I learned from those who had, or from the man himself in the years after everything was settled, and he was finally willing to speak plainly about what it had cost him. I want to say clearly at the start what kind of story this is. It is not a story about a dramatic public reversal. It is not about a ballroom and a proud man claiming a woman before the sneering society that scorned her, and the cruel being humbled while the crowd looks on in stunned silence. There is a little of that in the end. There is always a little of that when a duke announces his intentions, but it is not the engine of the thing. What drives this story is quieter, and I think more true to life. 2 people in the same house for 10 years, noticing each other across a distance that neither of them felt permitted to cross, and finding every possible way to take care of each other from that distance, and calling it professionalism, and calling it service, and calling it the proper management of their respective positions, until the management became heavier than the truth it was managing, and one of them finally picked up a bag to go, and the other one could not let it leave. That is the shape of it. Everything else is what happened in between. The parts that matter most are all about Marin. I say that now so you know where to look. Part 1, the first years, 1803 to 1808. She arrived at Ashford Court on the 4th of October, 1803. I know the date because I was there when she arrived, though not because of her. I had come ahead of Havenmore on a state business. Some boundary paperwork required my witness, and I had driven up from London the previous day. I was established in the East Library with my 2nd cup of coffee and a newspaper several days out of date when the estate wagon came around from the servants' yard. I was at the window when she got down. She stood in the courtyard for a moment, looking at the house. Ashford Court is a large house, not the largest in the county, but large enough to make the weight of itself felt, to register as something that a person with any sense takes seriously. Most people encountering it for the first time either diminish themselves very slightly or perform a careful not diminishing that amounts to the same thing. She did neither. She looked at it with the direct assessing attention of someone who has come to do a job and is taking the measure of the job. Then Mrs. Hartley appeared at the servants' entrance, and Marin went in, and I went back to my coffee. I thought no more about her for a week. Callum Ashford, the 7th Duke of Havenmore, arrived on the 15th of December, as he arrived every 15th of December, in a black traveling carriage through a sleet storm, with a minimal acknowledgement of the assembled entrance hall staff, and with the particular quality of motion that belongs to a man who knows exactly where he is going and has no patience for anything that impedes it. He was in his study with the accumulated estate correspondence within 20 minutes. I was in the library. He came in at 6:30, poured brandy without speaking, settled across from me in his usual chair and said, "How bad is it?" "The Northfield drainage has worsened again," I said, "but the tenancy renewals went smoothly. Pemberton has everything in order." "Good," he drank. He looked at the fire. This is what a reunion between us looked like after 20 years. We had met at Oxford when we were 18. He a thin, serious young man with a reputation for quiet brilliance and a pronounced inability to suffer anything he considered a waste of his time. I a somewhat less serious young man who had found, to my great surprise and lasting profit, that he was the best company I had ever had when nobody else was present. He had gone on to become the Duke of Havenmore when his father died, and to marry well, and to be something approaching happy, in the quiet, contained way of a man for whom happiness is a private matter best not examined too closely. And then in 1799 the fever had come and taken his wife and infant son, and in the years since he had become, gradually, without deciding to, the thing that ballrooms called the haunted Duke when they were sure no one connected to him was listening. The haunted Duke. The man who had sealed his grief into his work and his estates and his composure, and presented the world a face of such controlled authority that most people concluded there was nothing behind it. Most people had not spent 20 years as his friend. There was a great deal behind it. The difficulty was that he had become, in the years since the loss, extraordinarily skilled at ensuring none of it was visible. In public, he was impeccable. In private, in the library after dinner with brandy and no expectation of performance, he was more himself, drier, warmer, occasionally capable of something that was almost wit. But even in private, the grief was never spoken of directly. We had arrived at an understanding about what required speech and what could be carried in silence. The grief was in the second category. He carried it well. I did not push. The best I could offer was the annual week and a half at Ashford Court, and the library, and the brandy, and the absence of any demand that he be anything other than what he was. On the third morning of that first Christmas visit, Marin brought the morning tray to the library. She knocked once, entered at his word, set the tray beside his desk with the unhurried competence of someone who has absorbed a new routine completely, poured the first cup without being asked, and was withdrawing when he said, without looking up from his correspondence, "The fire is low." She said, "Yes, Your Grace, I'll see to it directly." She crossed to the hearth and built the fire, quietly, without hurrying, without performing efficiency for an audience, rose when it caught, and turned for the door. He said, "Thank you." I was in the far armchair with my book, and I glanced up, because he did not typically thank the servants. This was not from cruelty, I want to be clear about that. There was nothing cruel in the man, but from the absorbed quality of someone who moves through his physical surroundings with his attention directed largely elsewhere, the way a scholar inhabits a library, knowing it exists, depending on it, rarely registering it with conscious thought. He thanked her. He returned to his correspondence. She left. I returned to my book. I thought nothing of it. I was, as I have said, a fool. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper at the time of Marin's arrival, a woman of 40 years' experience and the particular clear-eyed competence of someone who has been running other people's households long enough to know exactly what she is doing, identified Marin within 3 months. Not dramatically. Mrs. Hartley's judgments were practical, arrived at by observation and confirmed by results. She moved Marin into positions of more responsibility as they became available, and when Marin met each one without difficulty, moved her into the next. By the second Christmas, she was managing the parlor service. By the third, she was assigned as the Duke's personal household attendant during his stays at Ashford Court. Mrs. Hartley conveyed this decision to Pemberton, the estate steward, a man of excellent circumspection who managed the Duke's affairs with an efficiency that matched his employer's, with the observation that the Ashby girl was the only member of the indoor staff who did not flutter in the Duke's presence, and that a man who found fuss disagreeable ought to have fuss kept from him at every opportunity. It was a practical determination. The fact that it was also, in retrospect, the arrangement that changed everything could not have been apparent to Mrs. Hartley, and she would have been deeply uncomfortable at the suggestion. I observed the new arrangement at the third Christmas, with the vague approval of a man who notices that something works without examining why. She was good at the job, genuinely good, in the way of someone who has thought about every element of the environment she manages and made deliberate decisions about it. The fire was built before he mentioned it was low. The second cup came at precisely the right interval. The curtains adjusted for the afternoon light when he moved his chair, without instruction. She moved through the rooms she was responsible for like a person who has considered all the variables and resolved them in advance. He worked, she managed. They were in the same rooms frequently, and the rooms were quiet. He did not speak to her beyond the necessities of the occasion. She did not address him unless addressed. They did not have anything that could be called a conversation. But, in the fourth year, watching more carefully than I had before, I began to catch things I had previously let pass without registering. The fractional pause, 2 seconds, not more before he returned to his work after she left the room. The marginally longer attention when she set something near his hand than the task required. The quality of his stillness when she was present versus when she was not. Not different in any overt way, but differently weighted, as though the control of it were being applied against something specific rather than maintained as a general and characterless discipline. I told myself I was imagining it. In the fourth year, I also noticed that he had begun using her name. Not consistently, not in any obvious way. But on 2 occasions, once when acknowledging the morning tray, and once at the end of the day when she came to collect it, he said Miss Ashby rather than simply proceeding without address. It was a small departure from his practice, small enough that I questioned whether I had actually heard it. I had heard it. I sat with that, turning it over. I did not know what to make of it. I told myself it was nothing. I kept thinking about it. In the 5th year, there was the physician. Marin fell ill in November, a chest cough that deepened rather than improved, and Agnes Plym was assigned to the library detail in her absence. Agnes did everything correctly. The fire was built. The tray was managed. Nothing went wrong. On the 4th morning of the visit, Havenmore sought out Mrs. Hartley. Mrs. Hartley told me about it that evening over her habitual 9 o'clock tea, a ritual I had been invited to share on occasion over the years. She had the expression of a woman who has encountered something she cannot place in any of her existing categories. He asked after Miss Ashby, she said. By name, he asked how she was and whether she had had a physician. She had not. The household budget did not extend to physicians for ordinary staff ailments. By that evening, the village physician had attended Marin at the estate's expense. The charge appeared in the accounts under medical staff welfare. No further notation. I sat with this information for 3 days. Then, one evening in the library, when neither of us had spoken for an hour, I said, as neutrally as I could, "The Ashby girl seems to be recovering well." He turned a page. Good. Considerate of you to send Morley. A pause, 2 seconds exactly. The estate provides for its people. Of course, I said. I went back to my book. He went back to his work. But I thought about it for weeks, for months, actually, into the new year and across the spring and through the following summer. The estate provides for its people. The institutional construction, the impersonal framing, the careful management of a small and personal act at the maximum possible distance from any acknowledgement of the person behind it. I thought, why would he need to manage a thing like that at a distance? I thought, I am probably imagining things. But in December of the 5th year, when Marin returned to duty and came to the library with the morning tray for the first time since November, he said good morning to her. Not to Agnes, not in any previous year, but to her, specifically, when she came through the door, and she said good morning, Your Grace, in return, and they did not speak again until the tray was collected. But the good morning had happened, and I had not misheard it. In the 6th year, Marin was appointed head of the household staff at Ashford Court. Mrs. Hartley was retiring to Bath. She submitted her notice in spring with the recommendation that the replacement be found internally. Pemberton prepared a list of 3 candidates. I was in the library when he presented them to Havenmore. He had completed perhaps half of his presentation of the first candidate's qualifications when Havenmore said, Ashby. Pemberton paused. Your Grace. Miss Ashby, from the parlor detail. Her name is Marin Ashby, Your Grace. She is 24. She has been with the house since 1803. I know how long she has been with the house, Havenmore said, with the patience of a man whose decision has been made and who is waiting for the mechanism to catch up. Confirm the appointment. Pemberton confirmed it. After he withdrew, Havenmore returned to his work with the same absorbed precision as always. I sat in the armchair and thought about what I had just witnessed. An appointment confirmed before the presentation of the other candidates had started, with a certainty that assumed no further information was required. He had known her name in the 5th year. He knew how long she had been with the house. He had decided the appointment before Pemberton finished his first sentence. I told myself this was the behavior of a man who pays close attention to his household staff, which was true. I told myself that the appointment was the obvious choice on professional grounds, which was also probably true. I told myself that there was nothing more to it than that. I was becoming quite skilled at telling myself things I did not fully believe. The 7th year I came to Ashford Court more often than I could entirely account for, and I discovered the cottage. Not through any admission of his. I found it in the maintenance accounts. Larkspur Cottage, eastern boundary, renovated in the spring. New roof, windows pointing. Kitchen garden cleared and replanted. I had known Larkspur Cottage for 20 years. A decent structure in mild disrepair, unoccupied for most of the time I had been visiting. I asked Pemberton about the renovation in passing, as though it were an idle curiosity. He said His Grace prioritized it. I said, who occupies it now? He said, no one at present. It's maintained for household use, senior domestic accommodation. I said, whose specification was the kitchen garden? A brief pause. His Grace selected from the options presented. What options? I said. Several configurations, said Pemberton. He selected the one with a productive herb garden and a south-facing vegetable aspect. He had personally selected the kitchen garden arrangement for a cottage listed for the use of the household's senior domestic manager, who was Marin Ashby, who did not know the cottage existed. I went for a long walk that evening in the actual kitchen garden, the one behind the house, with its old brick walls and its south-facing herb rows. And I thought about a man who had had a cottage renovated and a kitchen garden arranged to his own specification for a woman he would not approach directly, and had not told her any of it. I thought this is love expressed in the only form he believes he is permitted to use: provision, arrangement, the careful, anonymous construction of a future for someone he will not claim. I thought this is going to end either very well or very badly, and I do not yet know which. In the 8th year I came to Ashford Court in midsummer for a boundary dispute that genuinely required my presence and my signature, and I found Havenmore in the kitchen garden on a warm May afternoon with his back to the house, and his hands clasped behind him, watching Marin work in the herb rows. He was watching her the way a man watches something he cannot have and cannot make himself stop wanting. I know that particular quality of stillness, the controlled longing of it, the discipline barely holding. I had worn it myself once, a long time ago, before I was wise enough to act. He became aware of me and came inside and said, "The boundary papers are in the study, 10 minutes. That evening I said, "You ought to be careful." He said, "Of what?" I said, "You know precisely what." He said, "There is nothing to be careful of." I said, "Callum." He said, "Edmund, please." I let it go. I went home 2 days later and thought about the kitchen garden for a fortnight. Then I came back, because I could not come back, because the situation was developing in a direction that I was not convinced would develop well without some intervention, and I had decided that being his friend, in this particular circumstance, meant being willing to say things that were uncomfortable. I came back in the autumn, at Christmas, through the 9th year more often than I could strictly justify to any outside observer. I was watching, and in the 9th year I learned, finally, the full scope of what had been happening. The debt first. In April I was walking in the kitchen garden when Marin came through on some errand, and we fell into conversation about the spring planting, about the estate, and then, somehow, about her brother, who farmed a small holding in Hertfordshire and had had a difficult year. A creditor pressing, the usual accumulating difficulties of a small farm in a hard season. She said the debt was cleared, said it matter-of-factly the way she said everything. A solicitor managed it. The firm handled my father's affairs. I recognized the name. A pause. There was no name attached to the payment. She looked at the rosemary. "I have a theory," she said. She said nothing further. I said nothing further. We stood for a moment in the kitchen garden in the April warmth, and then she went on with her errand. I went inside and sat in the library for a long time. She knew, she had traced it as far as she could, and she had a theory, and the theory was correct, and she was managing the knowing of it, in the same way, I understood now, that he was managing the feeling of it. Both of them at the same line, from opposite sides, managing the same thing, calling it what could be named. The fund I discovered in September, reviewing the estate papers at his request for a legal matter entirely unrelated to Marin. It was there in the accounts, listed under a heading that could be read as a standard staff provision unless you read the actual terms, which I did. A quarterly payment in perpetuity to M. Ashby, regardless of her continued service, requiring nothing of her but that she receive it. Established in the autumn of the 9th year. First payment pending his instruction to activate. He had not yet activated it. I sat with the document for a long time. Then I went to the library and found him at his desk and said, "I know about all of it, the cottage, the fund, the debt." He set down his pen. "She knows about the debt," I said. "She traced it to your solicitor's firm. She didn't find you specifically, but she has a theory. and I believe the theory is correct. He looked at the fire. You have been, I said, building her a future, quietly, anonymously over 6 years. The physician, the appointment, the cottage, the debt, the fund, all of it provided, none of it named. All of it given from the maximum possible distance from any direct acknowledgement of why. He said nothing. I understand the concern about the power differential, I said. I understand that approaching a woman who is employed by your household, whose income and standing depend on your goodwill, is not a neutral act. That is a real concern, and I have respected it. But you have been using it. You have been using a real concern as shelter for a simpler one, that she might say no. And the shelter has held for 6 years, and she is going to leave eventually, to marriage, to a better position elsewhere, to a family situation that requires her. And when she does, you will have provided for everything except the honest thing. He said she might say no. Tell her about the cottage and the fund first, I said. Give her the ground under her feet. Make it clear that those things are hers regardless of her answer. Then ask. She will know that she has alternatives, that she can refuse you and still have the cottage and the fund and a reference that opens every door in England, and then her yes, if she gives it, is genuinely hers. He was very quiet. Edmund, he said, give me time. How much, I said. He didn't answer. I gave him time. I went home, I came back. I came back again. And in the autumn of the 10th year the letter arrived from her brother, and she gave her notice, and my time ran out. Part 2, the 10th year, 1813. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in September. His wife had been poorly since spring. A third child in July, the recovery difficult, the household struggling. He needed help. He asked if Marin could come. She wrote back the same afternoon. She gave notice to Pemberton on Thursday, 3 weeks. Pemberton brought the notice to Havenmore on Friday morning. I was in the library. I watched Havenmore read it. He said 3 weeks. Pemberton said, yes, Your Grace, her brother's household in Hertfordshire. His wife has been unwell. A pause. He set the document to one side. Thank you, Pemberton. Pemberton left. I sat very still and did not look up from my book. 4 minutes of silence, the clock, the fire. He rose and walked to the window and stood there for 12 minutes. Then he returned to his desk and began to write. I assumed the reference, the comprehensive, generous, professionally impeccable thing that a responsible employer writes for a valued departing member of staff. He was writing to his solicitor, activate the fund immediately. Transfer Larkspur Cottage into Marin Ashby's name outright, fully deeded, hers alone. Increase the quarterly sum by 1/3. He was giving her everything he could give her, without standing up from his desk. I stayed. I had planned to leave Ashford Court by the end of the week. The week ended and I found reasons. The weather uncertain. A letter delayed, a horse slightly off. The household managed the transition. Marin managed the handover with the thoroughness she brought to everything. She prepared the household guide for Agnes across several evenings at the office table. 14 pages, every procedure and preference and seasonal consideration, all the knowledge of 10 years in the house given to her successor in systematic, readable form. I read the guide later at my request, weeks after. Agnes let me read it because I asked. The paragraph that has stayed with me, that I could reproduce now without any effort of memory. His Grace takes his morning tea at 7:30, with a second cup requested at 9. The blend should be lighter on mornings following a late lamp in the library. The oil lamp burning past midnight indicates a poor night's sleep, most frequently during the parliamentary recess months or during periods of estate difficulty. He does not request an adjustment and is not aware that one is made. The adjustment should be made without remark. She had been doing this for 3 years, watching the lamp through the night, adjusting the blend in the morning, giving him a small considered care he did not know he was receiving. She had done it without mention, without recognition, without any expectation that he would ever know. And she had written it down for Agnes so that the care would continue after she was gone. I went outside after reading it and stood in the kitchen garden for a while in the November cold and thought about what it meant to love someone in that particular way. To give care at the maximum distance from any claim on it, anonymously, for the pure sake of the giving. He had been doing the same thing from his side. The cottage and the debt and the fund and the physician in November and the appointment confirmed without hesitation. All of it love given without a name on it, without any claim, given because it was the only kind he believed he was permitted to offer. Two people, both of them loving from a distance, both of them managing, both of them standing at the same line for 6 years. I thought one of them needs to cross it, and it is not going to be her, and the window is closing. 9 days before her departure, Havenmore's family arrived. His sister, Lady Frederica Marsh, had been planning this for months. She had written to him about a family visit without mentioning the Vanes. She had written to Lord and Lady Vane about an excellent opportunity, the Duke in residence. She had arranged the timing so she arrived the day before and had 12 hours to establish herself. Frederica was not subtle, she was effective. She arrived with Lord Marsh, their 2 children, and the energy of a woman who has decided her brother's life requires correction. The Vanes arrived the following morning, Lord and Lady Vane, expansive and well-bred, and their daughter Lady Constance, 23, fair, composed, genuinely intelligent in the observing way. Lady Constance had been intended for Havenmore. This had been understood by everyone involved for 2 years, and declined by Havenmore through the mechanism of persistent polite unavailability, and now Frederica had decided that unavailability had gone on long enough. Havenmore received everyone with the impeccable courtesy that was his social default, attentive, considerate, providing exactly the warmth the occasion required and not 1 degree more. He rode with Lord Marsh in the mornings. He sat beside Lady Constance at dinner as Frederica arranged. He listened to Lady Vane speak about the London season with patient civility. He was also, behind all of it, somewhere else entirely. He was in the morning room on Tuesday, the connecting door a fraction open. He was in the east sitting room on Thursday evening, while the weekly accounts were reviewed in the east corridor beyond the wall. He rode past the kitchen garden wall every afternoon, slowing at the lowest point before picking up pace. He was memorizing her, running out of time to do it. On the 3rd evening at dinner, Lord Vane made the expected remark about well-managed houses and capable domestic arrangement, with a glance at Havenmore that was intended to suggest the conversation and its conclusion. Havenmore said, "The credit belongs entirely to my household staff. My housekeeper in particular has managed this house with an excellence I have not seen elsewhere." Lord Vane adjusted his approach and said something about looking forward to knowing whose hands it would be in going forward. Havenmore said, "Miss Ashby leaves in 9 days. I confess I have not yet determined how to replace her. It may not be possible to do so fully." He said this without inflection as a statement of fact. Then, "Shall we discuss the harvest? I understand you've had a better season in the south." I watched Lady Constance during this exchange. She was watching Havenmore. She was drawing conclusions, and the conclusions were accurate. On the Tuesday of the 2nd week, she came into the library at 7:30 and set the tray and poured the cup, and he said, without looking up, "I understand you've been preparing instructions for Miss Plym." She stopped the small adjustments she was making. "Yes, Your Grace. A household guide, the routines, the preferences, the seasonal arrangements. I want Agnes to have everything before I go." Pemberton mentioned it, a pause. He said it was thorough. "I hope it will be useful." "I should like to read it," he said, "all of it." A brief pause. "Of course, Your Grace." She was about to withdraw. He said, "Miss Ashby." She stopped. "The blend is lighter this morning." A pause, a specific weighted pause. She said, "You've been working late, Your Grace." "The lamp." "Yes." He said, "How long have you been doing that?" She said, 3 years, perhaps a little longer. He said, "I wasn't aware." She said, "There was no need to be. That's the point of doing it quietly." He turned fully to look at her. Not the glance of acknowledgement, fully, directly, with the quality of attention he gave things he was genuinely examining. She met his gaze with the steady gray eyes that had always, it seemed to me, seen exactly what was there. He said, "Thank you, Miss Ashby." She said, "You are very welcome, Your Grace." She left. He sat at his desk and looked at the door for a moment after she was gone. Then he took the household guide from the drawer where Pemberton had left it the day before and began to read from the first page. He read it for the rest of the morning. I know which paragraph stopped him. I know because I was in the room and I saw the quality of his stillness change when he reached it. A specific, different stillness. The stillness of a man who has encountered something that has done something to him and is sitting with it. He sat with both hands flat on the desk and looked at the paragraph and then looked at the fire and then set the guide down and rose and left the library. I heard him go out the east door toward the park. I heard the door close. He walked for 2 hours. I tracked him from the window, across the park, down to the river, along the river path, back by the Lime Avenue. When he returned, he went to his study and closed the door, and I did not see him again until dinner. At dinner he was composed. He ate. He thanked the footman. He said nothing about the household guide. 4 days before the departure, I found him in the kitchen garden. Same spot, same posture. The herb rose bare in the November cold, his back to the house. I came and stood beside him in the cold. 4 days, I said. I know. She leaves in 4 days, and you have arranged everything except the honest thing. He said nothing. She loves you, I said. She has been managing the love of you for years, the same way you have been managing the feeling of it. She's going to take her bag to Hertfordshire because she does not believe she is permitted to stay. And she is going to spend the rest of her life not staying. And you are going to spend the rest of yours in this library, and the morning tea will never again be right, and you will have done it to yourselves through nothing more complicated than fear. He said, what if she says no? I said, she wrote instructions for Agnes, for the tea, for how to adjust the blend when the lamp burns late. She wrote it for the person who will do it after she's gone. A woman who writes that does not write it as a professional duty. She writes it because she cannot help herself. He was very still. She cannot cross the line from her side, I said. She does not believe she is permitted to. She needs you to say something. She needs you to cross it first so she can follow, or to follow you if you cross it. She will not go alone. A long silence, the cold kitchen garden, a rook calling somewhere. He said, Edmund. Yes. Go away. It was the quality of the go away that told me everything. This was not a wall being placed. This was a man assembled toward a decision, needing the room to carry it through. I went. I was in the east corridor that evening when he went to the small sitting room where she was working late on the accounts. The door was open a few inches. She said, Your Grace, I was just finishing. He said, a moment if you would. A pause. He said, I need to say some things that I have not said. The first, the cottage, Larkspur Cottage on the eastern path, has been renovated and is yours. Has been yours since the 7th year, registered in the estate's provision for you. Pemberton has the details. The second, there is a quarterly fund established in your name, first payment pending my instruction, which I am giving now. Both of these things are yours regardless of anything else. I want you to know what you have before I say the rest. Silence. He said, the rest. A pause. I have been in love with you since the 4th year. I understood it then, and I spent 6 years finding every possible reason why I was not in a position to say so. The power I hold over your circumstances, the impossibility of an honest approach from where I stood, all real concerns, also convenient ones. The real reason beneath all of them was that I was afraid of your answer, and so I arranged things instead. I provided for things. I managed everything at the greatest possible distance from the honest thing, and I called it care for your situation, and it was, but it was also cowardice. The care was real. The cowardice under it was equally real. A long, long silence. He said, I am asking you now because you are leaving in 4 days, and if I let you go without asking, I will not recover from it. Will you marry me? The silence that followed was the longest I had sat through. Then Marin said, you could have simply asked. And something in the room changed, a quality of air, a release, something that I felt even through the wall. He said quietly, I know. She said, 6 years ago, you could have simply asked. I know, he said, I was afraid. She said, you arranged a cottage. Yes. And cleared my brother's debt. Yes. And established a fund. Yes. All of that, she said, and you could not simply ask. No, he said, I was a coward. A pause. You, she said, and there was something in her voice that had been very tightly contained for a very long time, and was finding the first crack in the containing. The Duke of Havenmore, the most feared man in 3 counties, were afraid of me. Specifically of you, he said, from the 4th year. She said, "That is the most foolish thing I have ever heard." "Yes," he said, "I know." Silence. She said, "I have to write to my brother." He waited. "To tell him I'm not coming," she said. He said, "Marin." She said, "Yes, Callum." One word, but it was fully given. I went back down the corridor to the library and sat in my armchair and looked at the fire. There it is, I thought. 10 years of mornings and 3 weeks and a bag that was never going to leave the house. There it is. He told Frederica that evening. Directly, without preamble. He had asked Miss Ashby to be his wife. She had accepted. The announcement would be made within the week. Frederica was quiet for a full minute. Then the housekeeper, Callum. "Yes, her name is Marin." Another silence. She said, "I have watched her manage this house for 4 years. She does it better than I could, and I was raised to it." He said, "Yes." She said, "How long?" "Since the 4th year." She looked at him for a long time with the searching quality she reserves for things she needs to fully understand before deciding what to do with them. Then she said, "She will need something decent to wear for the announcement dinner." That was the endorsement. He told Lord and Lady Vane the following morning, before they had their traveling coats on, considerately, directly, with the acknowledgement of a man who respects the people he is disappointing even when the disappointment is their own miscalculation. Lady Constance was present. When he finished, she said, "I wish you very great happiness, I mean it." He said, "Thank you. I am sorry you were brought here under expectations. I should have corrected earlier." She said, "You should not have waited so long. A man who knows what he wants should say so." He said, "You are entirely right." She shook his hand, not the done thing, but she did it, and went to find her coat. I liked her very much. I have said that, and I will say it again. Part 3 after. The announcement made its expected rounds through the social world and produced its expected commotion. The Duke of Havenmore was marrying his housekeeper. The commentary was not uniformly kind. It had a short life. Havenmore's response to unkind remarks was always the same. The quality of his attention when the subject arose in his presence, the particular stillness of a man waiting for a sentence to finish so he could make clear, without raising his voice, that the matter was not open for further discussion. From a man of his reputation, this response was highly effective. The commentary subsided within weeks. Frederica's public endorsement did the rest. She told everyone who mattered, with the certainty of a woman whose assessments are not opinions but facts, that the new Duchess of Havenmore was going to manage the dukedom better than it had been managed in 20 years, and that anyone who doubted this had not looked at the estate accounts. She was right, and Frederica being right publicly tends to resolve things. The wedding was on a Saturday in November in the estate chapel. Small, as Havenmore had directed. Family, close friends, the household staff in the rear pews, this last his own decision, made without announcement, conveyed to Pemberton with the quiet firmness of a decision already made. Marin wore cream. Frederica had insisted, correctly overriding Marin's stated preference for gray on the grounds that practicality has its place but not everywhere. The gown was cream wool, simply made, without the ornament of the season. She looked entirely like herself in it, fully present, without performance, unhurried and direct. She was incandescent. I use that word, and I mean it precisely. Not in the conventional sense. She was not dramatically beautiful in the way the season bred for. She was herself, completely and without overlay, and that quality filled the chapel with something that no quantity of silk or pearls could have produced. Her brother walked beside her, gray-eyed like her, barely holding together. Agnes Plym was on her other side and was absolutely not crying, in the absolute way of someone refusing to admit to a feeling that is entirely visible. Old Hewson, the head gardener, was in the last pew with his hat in his lap, and his head bowed. Pemberton sat very straight and showed nothing on his face, which required considerable effort. Havenmore stood at the front of the chapel. He watched her come down the aisle. His face did something I had not seen it do in 20 years. The management came off, briefly, completely, for the length of time it took her to come through the door and move toward him, and what was underneath it was entirely visible. I will not describe it in detail because it was private, but I was watching, and I will say, In 20 years of knowing Callum Ashford, I had never seen his face do that, and I will not forget it. The vicar read the service, the old words to have and to hold, to love and to cherish. When he said to cherish, his voice was low and weighted with the specific gravity of a man who means everything he says and means this most of all. When Marin said her vows, she said them directly, without ornament, with the complete conviction of a woman who has thought very carefully about a decision and is committing to it with her whole self. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, he took her hand. In the rear pews, Agnes Plym produced a sound that was definitely not a cough. Pemberton maintained his composure with visible effort. Her brother stopped trying. I sat in my pew and felt the thing I have tried to find a word for and have not. The feeling of a man who has watched something he cared about refuse to go wrong, finally, after 10 years of it almost going wrong in every possible direction. The months after were the ordinary, extraordinary months of two capable people who had decided to run something together. She found 3 significant inefficiencies in the land management within 6 weeks. She presented them in 11 pages set on his desk on a Thursday morning with, "Your thoughts when you have the time." He read it twice, called Pemberton and the land agent and the estate lawyer, and began corrections the following morning. The improvements were material. Pemberton told me, with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided that professional admiration is consistent with his dignity. The Duchess has a particular angle on land management. She does, I said. His Grace finds it useful. He does. Pemberton looked at his ledger. It is, he said, choosing his words with the precision of a man for whom precision is the highest value. A considerable improvement. Frederica came 3 times in the first year. By the 3rd visit, she and Marin were going through the London season correspondence together with the efficient clarity of 2 women who have decided, without ceremony, to get on with it. When Frederica left, she told Lord Marsh that she was glad Callum had finally stopped being a fool, even if it had taken him an unconscionable amount of time. Larkspur Cottage was given to old Hewson and his wife within the month, Marin's proposal, accepted by Havenmore without argument. She walked to the cottage herself to deliver the news. Hewson opened the door, looked at her, said "Your Grace" for the first time, and bowed his head. She said something quiet in reply. I was too far away to hear it. She walked back through the kitchen garden, through the herb rows, past the place where I had once watched Havenmore stand watching her, and I watched her go and thought about all of it. The whole long, complicated, quiet decade of it. I thought, look at what this house has become. The second winter, Christmas at Ashford Court as it had always been. The library, the brandy, the snow soft against the windows. I said, "Do you regret the years?" He was quiet for a long time. "Yes and no," he said. "I regret the silence." She carried the knowing of the debt for 2 years alone. She had worked it out and she was managing it, and I left her no way to do anything with the managing except carry on managing it. That was mine to give her. The permission to speak, the right to know that what she suspected was true and that she could say so. I gave her silence instead, and I called it consideration for her position, and it was cowardice in a better coat. She forgave it, I said. She did, he said. That is the thing I was least certain of. Not being refused, I had prepared myself for refusal. Being understood and forgiven. Because to be forgiven requires being fully seen, and being fully seen was the thing I had been most carefully avoiding for 6 years. She sees things fully, I said. She always has, he said. I think that was part of it from the beginning that she saw me. Not the title, not the reputation, not the Duke of Havenmore who frightens people by existing. Simply what was actually there. We sat with the fire. Edmund, he said after a while. Yes. She brought me tea this morning. I looked at him. She came in at 7:30, he said. Set the tray, poured the cup. I called her back from the door and she came back and sat in the window chair and read while I worked. The settled quality in his voice, the specific quality of a man who has arrived somewhere and is still learning to be there. We were in the library, in the morning, not because she was serving and I was being served, because she chose to be there. Because it is Tuesday, and she likes the mornings in the library. A pause. That is the whole of what I wanted, he said. Not the grand thing, not the public claiming, simply her there, by choice. The morning tea arriving and then her because she wants to be there because the library in the morning is where she wants to spend the time. And I look up when she comes in, and we are there together, and it is entirely ordinary and it is everything I have. I said nothing, there was nothing to add to it. The snow came against the windows, the fire settled low and red. The door opened. Marin, in her dressing gown, lamp in hand, with the expression of a woman who has waited long enough for the evening to arrive at a reasonable conclusion. She said, "Callum." He rose from his chair without argument. He paused in the doorway and looked back at me. There was nothing in the look that required speech, and he had always been careful with speech when it was not required. I raised my glass. He went out. The door closed. I sat in the empty room with the portraits of the dead Dukes of Havenmore looking down from the walls and the fire going low and the snow quiet outside, and I thought about all of it. The 4th year and the first name I heard him use, the 5th year and the physician in November, the 6th year and the appointment confirmed before the presentation was half finished, the 7th year and a cottage on the eastern path with a kitchen garden arranged to specifications he had selected himself. The 8th year and a kitchen garden in August, and 2 faces managing 2 versions of the same impossible thing. The 9th year and a brother's debt cleared through an intermediary, a fund established and waiting, a conversation in April among the rosemary. The 10th year and 14 pages of a household guide and a paragraph about a lamp burning late, and 3 years of a lighter morning blend given without remark, and a traveling bag at the foot of the stairs. And a door opened 2 inches in the east corridor, and 1 word fully given. How could a man like that be undone by a woman who poured his morning tea? He was not undone by it. He was found by it. Found 1 morning at a time, across 10 years. Found by the fire built before he mentioned it was low. By the 2nd cup poured at the right interval. By 3 years of lighter blend because the lamp burned late, and a window checked in the dark, and a care given without expectation of recognition, and the decision to write it all down for a successor so it would continue after she was gone. He was finding her in return, with the cottage and the debt and the fund and the physician in November, and the appointment confirmed without a second thought, in the only form he believed he was permitted, both of them loving from a distance, both of them managing, both of them standing at the same line for 6 years, from opposite sides, until the weight of 10 years of mornings became heavier than the fear. And she set the bag down. And he said her name without the miss. And she said his without the grace. And they were finally in the same room. The morning tea was never a small thing. It was, from the very first cup, everything. And every morning since, she brings it because she wants to, because it is Tuesday and she likes the mornings in the library, and he looks up when she comes in, and they are there together in the ordinary morning light, and it is entirely ordinary, and it is the whole world. That is the story, all of it. Everything else is the house carrying on, which is the best possible end for a house that has been waiting for its right people all along. I should perhaps say more about the house itself, since a house shapes the people who live in it, and Ashford Court had been shaping Havenmore since his birth. It was built in the 2nd half of the previous century by his grandfather, a duke of rather more flamboyant sensibilities than any of his descendants. You can see it in the dining room ceiling, which is a great deal more ornate than anything the current generation of Ashfords would have commissioned. The house settled, over the following decades, into the gravity that new buildings acquire only gradually, the weight of things that have been, the accumulation of decisions and seasons, and the quiet persistence of stone. The East Library was where Havenmore spent most of his time in residence. It caught the morning light from 6 to 11, and the afternoon shadow from noon onward, which suited a man who did his best work in the morning and read in the afternoons. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 2 walls, the kind of collection that had grown over 3 generations, and now contained not only what the current Duke read, but what his father and grandfather had read, and what had been acquired from auctions and estates, and the general accretion of a family that had been wealthy enough for long enough to buy books whenever books were available. There were scientific texts and legal volumes and the complete historical record of the estate's management going back to the 17th century. There were novels, acquired by Havenmore's grandmother and never removed. There were, in the locked lower cabinet, 3 volumes that I have always suspected Havenmore's grandfather purchased on an adventure abroad and never looked at again. The fire in the library was built up every morning before 7:30, so that the room was warm by the time the morning tray arrived. In the first years, it was built by whoever was assigned to the library detail. In the third year, it was built by Marin. By the fourth year, she was building it before the hour because she had observed that the room required 20 minutes to warm properly, and the fire was better for being started early. She had observed this and acted on it without instruction, without comment. She simply started building the fire earlier because the fire was better for it, and therefore the room was better, and therefore the morning was better, and that was reason enough. I tell you this because I think it is the key to everything. Not the dramatic moments, though there are those, and I will give them their proper weight. The key to this particular love story is the way she moved through the world, noticing what the thing actually needed and giving it that, without calculation, without announcement, simply because the need was there, and she was the person who had noticed it. He was the same underneath the composure. He noticed what was needed. He gave it where he could without his name on it. Two people who loved in the same language. From opposite sides of a line neither of them felt permitted to cross. I want to tell you about the Tuesday of the second week, the week the Vanes were visiting, 2 weeks before her departure, when she came in and said the blend was lighter. I have given you the broad outline of that conversation. I want to give you the texture of it because the texture matters. She came in at 7:30, as she always did. She set the tray beside his desk with the economy of motion that had always characterized her work. Not hurried, not slow, simply efficient in the way of someone for whom efficiency is a kind of respect, a refusal to waste anyone's time. She poured the first cup. She placed it. She was about to withdraw. He said, without looking up from the letter he was annotating, "The blend is lighter." She stopped. There was a quality to the stop, not startled, not caught. The stop of someone who has been found out in something she had believed safely invisible, and is deciding what to do about being found. She said, "You've been working late, Your Grace." The lamp. Yes. A pause. He said, "How long have you been doing that?" She said, 3 years, perhaps a little longer. He set down his pen. He had not yet looked at her. He said, "I wasn't aware." She said, "There was no need to be. That's the point of doing it quietly." Then he turned, fully the way he turned when he was looking at something he actually intended to see. She met his eyes with the steady gray gaze she had always had, the gaze that saw directly what was there and did not add to it or subtract from it. The room was very quiet. He said, "Thank you for 3 years of it." She said, "You are very welcome, Your Grace," and withdrew. He sat at his desk and looked at the door for a moment after it closed. Then he took the household guide from the drawer. Pemberton had brought it the day before and began to read. I know when he reached the paragraph. I know because the quality of his stillness changed, became something specific and inward rather than general and composed. He sat with both hands flat on the desk and looked at the page and then at the fire, and the fire and the page seemed to occupy the same quality of his attention for a while. Then he set the guide down and rose and went out the east door to the park. He walked for 2 hours. I do not know what he thought about on that walk. I know that when he came back he went to his study and closed the door, and when he came down to dinner he was composed and civil and thanked the footman for the wine and made appropriate conversation, and I watched him across the table and thought, something has happened. Something has decided. What I did not know until much later from his own account. On that walk he finally stopped arguing with himself. He had been constructing the argument for 6 years. The power differential, the impossibility of the honest approach, the genuine concern for her position if she felt she could not refuse him. And the argument was real, all of it was real, but it had also been doing work it was not quite designed to carry. The argument about her position was real. The argument against his own fear was the part he had been leaving out. He told me this in the second winter, after he was able to talk about it plainly. "I walked to the river and I walked back," he said. "And I thought about the paragraph, and I thought about 3 years of a lighter blend that I had not been aware of, and I thought about the guide written for Agnes so it would continue after she was gone, and I thought, she has been loving me from the only distance she believes she is permitted, for years. The fire and the tray and the blend and the guide, all of it care given at the maximum distance from any claim, given for its own sake and nothing else. And I have been doing exactly the same thing in the opposite direction, and calling it management, and we have both been standing at the same wall for 6 years, and neither of us has moved. He looked at the fire, and then I thought, she is leaving in 11 days, and if I let her leave without saying the thing, I will spend the rest of my life certain that I had the chance and chose the cowardly road, and I will deserve everything that comes from that choice. He set down his brandy. So I stopped arguing with myself, he said. On the walk back, I simply stopped. 4 days before her departure, the kitchen garden. I have told you about this. I have told you what I said about the morning tea and the paragraph and the leaving in 4 days. What I have not told you is what it cost me to say it, because I am not a man given to emotional speeches, and I was making something that felt uncomfortably close to one. What I have also not told you is what he looked like, in those moments, standing in the bare November kitchen garden with his back to the house. He looked like a man at the end of a long argument with himself, which is what he was. He looked like someone who has been very disciplined for a very long time and has finally reached the limit of the discipline, not because the discipline broke, but because he walked to the limit of it himself and looked at what was on the other side and decided it was worth crossing too. He looked, in other words, like a man about to do something. When he said go away with that particular quality, I went. I went to the library and sat in my armchair and stared at the fire and felt something that I have since identified as the particular anxiety of a man who has done everything he can and is now required to wait. The conversation in the east sitting room lasted about 20 minutes. I have given you the broad lines of it. I want to fill in a few things I heard that I have not yet said. When he said I have been in love with you since the 4th year, her silence before she said anything back was perhaps 15 seconds. 15 seconds is a long time in a quiet room. When she finally said you could have simply asked, her voice had the quality it had always had: direct, unornamented, honest. But underneath the directness there was something that had been very tightly contained for a long time and was finding its first crack in the containing. Not hurt, not anger, something more complicated than either. The sound of a woman who has been managing a feeling across 6 years and is discovering in the space of a minute that the management was unnecessary. When she said you arranged a cottage, there was something in it that was almost, not quite, but almost, a laugh. The incredulous quality of someone discovering that what they thought was complicated was, from another angle, very simple, and that both of them had been choosing the complicated angle when the simple one was right there. When she said that is the most foolish thing I have ever heard, referring to his fear of her specifically, he, the Duke of Havenmore, feared by half of England, afraid of a housekeeper from Hertfordshire. The quality in her voice was one I had never heard from her before. It was the voice she used in the kitchen garden when the undergardener made an error so obvious that pointing it out felt almost unnecessary. It was the voice of someone who sees a thing clearly and is mildly astonished that the person in front of her did not. It was, in its way, the most intimate thing I had ever heard her say to him. And when she said yes, Callum, it was entirely quiet and entirely complete. The 3 weeks between the acceptance and the wedding were not without their difficulties. Frederica required managing. She had arrived at Ashford Court intending one outcome and had been presented with a different one. And while she had pivoted with the efficiency of a woman who prides herself on her adaptability, the pivot required a period of adjustment during which she was somewhat more present in the house than was entirely comfortable for anyone. She called on Marin twice in the first week, visits that I was not present for and did not ask about directly, though Agnes told me about them afterward. The first was what Frederica called a getting acquainted conversation, and what Agnes described as an interview conducted with the thoroughness of someone who has decided to be impressed, but has not decided to show it yet. The second was shorter and warmer, and ended with Frederica looking at the household accounts at Marin's invitation, and saying, apparently, that the ledgers were in better order than any of the other Havenmore properties, and she wished she knew who had been managing Marsh Hall's accounts. Marin told her, apparently, who she thought ought to be managing them, and why, and with what adjustments to the current system. Frederica, Agnes told me, had looked at her for a moment and then said, "You and I are going to get along." This was Frederica's highest available expression of approval. The Vanes departed on the Saturday, Lord and Lady Vane with the gracious stoicism of people who have revised their expectations and decided not to dwell on the revision. Lady Constance, in the entrance hall before the carriage, found me alone for a moment and said, "I suspected from the third day. He looks at her the way my father looks at the estate accounts, as though she is the most significant thing in the room and everything else is peripheral." I said, "She is." "Yes," she said, "that was very clear," a slight composed smile. "I wish them both very well. Tell him I said he ought not to have waited so long." "I'll tell him," I said. "Tell him I said it," she said. "Not that you agree with it because he knows you agree with it. Tell him that I said it too." She went out to the carriage. I was right in my assessment of her. A genuinely perceptive and dignified young woman who would have been, under different circumstances, an excellent match for a complicated man. As it was, she was simply an excellent young woman, which is not a small thing, and I hope she found someone who deserved it. The announcement went out through the proper channels in the third week of October and produced, as I have said, its expected social reaction. What I want to add to what I have already said is this. Marin's response to the social reaction was what I would, by that point, have expected of her. She did not perform indifference to it. She did not pretend the commentary did not exist or that it did not sting in places. She mentioned once to Havenmore in the library that she had read a particularly unkind piece in a publication whose editor she had previously thought reasonably fair, and that she found she minded it more than she had expected to. He said, "Does it change anything?" She said, "No." He said, "Then it doesn't matter." She said, "It matters a little." He said, "Yes, I know, I'm sorry for it." She said, "Don't apologize for other people's opinions. It isn't useful and it isn't accurate." He looked at her. She said, "What matters is that we know what we're doing and why." He said, "Yes." She said, "Good," and went back to the household accounts she had been reviewing when the subject arose. Agnes told me about this exchange. Agnes said she had been in the next room and heard most of it through the connecting door, and that she had had to put down her work for a moment and collect herself before she could continue. I understood completely. The morning of the wedding. I arrived at the chapel early, because I have always preferred to be early to things that matter. The estate's old chapel is a small stone building on the south side of the grounds, separated from the house by a formal garden and a yew hedge. Not very grand, as ducal chapels go, but with the particular gravity of something built to last and having lasted. It was warm inside, which I attributed to the fires lit at 5 in the morning by Pemberton's instruction. The vicar was already there, arranging things with the quiet efficiency of a man who has presided over many of these occasions and knows exactly what needs to happen and when. The staff began arriving at 1:15. They filed into the rear pews with the careful management of people determined to be inconspicuous, which is to say they were not inconspicuous at all, but they had clearly agreed among themselves that they would be quiet and dignified, and they were quiet and mostly dignified. Agnes sat at the end of a pew with her hands folded in her lap, and the expression of a woman whose entire emotional situation has been placed on strict internal lockdown and is being held there by main force. Old Hewson sat in the very last pew with his hat on his knee. He had come across from Larkspur Cottage in his Sunday coat. He sat very straight. Pemberton sat beside Agnes with the composure of a professional, which held. The family filed in. Frederica and Lord Marsh and their children, her brother and his wife and their 3 children managed in various states of Saturday morning cooperation by a nursemaid in the back corner. Her brother, I watched him as he took his place at the front of the chapel and waited. He was perhaps 26, gray-eyed like his sister, with the face of a man who has spent years working outdoors and the hands to match. He was not attempting composure. He was looking at the altar with an expression that required no description. I took my place and waited. Havenmore came in from the vestry at 5 to the hour. He stood at the front of the chapel with his hands clasped in front of him and waited. He did not look at the door. He looked at a fixed point in the middle distance, the habitual composure, the familiar management of a man who does not show anything publicly unless he has decided to. Then the organ began, a simple processional, not elaborate, chosen by Marin on the grounds that she preferred simplicity in music that was meant to be felt rather than admired, and the chapel door opened. She came in on her brother's arm with Agnes beside her. She was wearing the cream gown, simply made, without the ornament of a society wedding. She wore a small arrangement of late autumn flowers in her hair, something Agnes had done that morning. I understood, after a brief negotiation in which Marin had said she did not need flowers and Agnes had said she was wearing flowers, and that was final. She carried no bouquet. She held her brother's arm and walked with the unhurried directness that characterized everything she did. Havenmore heard the processional begin and turned to look. I was watching his face when he turned. I was watching specifically because I had waited 10 years for this, and I intended to miss nothing. What I saw, for approximately 4 seconds, the management came entirely off. Not dramatically, not with any particular show, just gone the way a shutter opens, the way a room looks different when you turn the lamp up. He looked at her coming toward him, and the face that had been impeccably composed for 20 years was simply not composed, and what was underneath was entirely readable. Then it came back, the composure returned, settled, held. But for those 4 seconds it was gone, and what was underneath was exactly what I had known was there for 6 years. She reached the altar, he took her hand. The vicar read the service. When Havenmore said the vows, to have and to hold, to love and to cherish from this day forward, his voice was low and precise, and carried the specific weight of a man who does not use words carelessly and means every one of these, particularly cherish. He said cherish in the tone of someone identifying the correct word after a long search and being glad to have found it. When Marin said her vows, she said them in the same voice she used in the household office, the voice she used reviewing accounts with Agnes or briefing Pemberton on the winter provisions, direct, clear, without ornament. But the voice was steady with something that went considerably deeper than professionalism. The vicar pronounced them. Havenmore took her hand more firmly. Agnes Plym made a sound. She had been holding it for so long that when it came, it was more significant than she had intended. Hewson bowed his head. Her brother stopped trying. I sat in my pew and felt the thing I have been trying to name since it happened. The closest I have come is this: the feeling of watching something arrive that has been on its way for a very long time and discovering that it is exactly what you knew it would be. The early months of the marriage were ones I observed with the attention of a man who has been waiting to see the result of a very long experiment. What I observed, 2 people discovering what it meant to be in the same room without the distance. He was not, in those early months, always certain how to do it. He had been Havenmore, the title, the composure, the managed distance, for so long that the habits of that self persisted even in the changed circumstances. I saw him, on one occasion, begin to retreat to the library during an afternoon when Marin was in the drawing room with Frederica, and catch himself on the threshold, and turn around and go in instead. It was a small thing, a few seconds of hesitation, a choice made without drama, but I had been watching him for 20 years and I knew what I was seeing. He was learning to choose close instead of far. For a man who had spent 6 years choosing far, this was not a small thing. She was learning too. She had spent 10 years in a particular role in this house, with the habits and the self-understanding that role had built into her, and now the role had changed, and she was finding out what she was in the new one. I watched her, occasionally, catch herself in a housekeeper's reflex, the instinct to defer, to qualify, to manage around the edges of a conversation rather than through the middle of it, and correct it with the direct efficiency she always brought to corrections. They were learning each other from close, which is a different thing than learning each other from far, even when you have been in the same house for 10 years. But, on a November afternoon in the first month of the marriage, I came into the library at 3:30 to find them both there. She was in the window chair with a book. He was at his desk with his correspondence. They were not talking. They were simply in the room. He looked up when I came in. There was something on his face in the moment before he registered that it was me, a quality of complete settledness, of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be and knows it, that I have been thinking about ever since. I made an excuse and went back out. Some rooms do not need visitors. On another occasion, a week or so later, I was passing the library in the morning and heard her voice through the partly open door. She was reading something aloud, a passage from one of the estate management volumes she had been working through with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything. He was at his desk working, making occasional sounds that indicated he was listening. She finished the passage and said, That approach to the South Field drainage would have cost 3 times what we actually spent on the solution. The author has clearly never been to the South Field. He said without looking up. The author has clearly never been to any field. She said he spent considerable time in his introduction explaining that he was primarily a theorist. He said, a theorist who wrote a great deal about drainage. She said, yes. I thought perhaps you might find it useful. He said, I found it a useful illustration of the difference between theory and field. She said, I'll note that in the margins. He said, please. I could hear the quality of his voice as he said, please. It was the voice of a man who has found a person he genuinely enjoys talking to and is still, in the early months of having found them, somewhat astonished by the discovery. I went on down the corridor. In the second winter, 3 months after the wedding, the estate manager for the northern properties came to Ashford Court with a problem. The problem was complicated, a dispute with a neighboring estate about water rights, a legal question that had been simmering for 2 years and had now reached the point at which it could not continue to simmer without becoming expensive. The estate manager, a capable man named Runcible, laid it out for Havenmore in the study with the supporting documents. It was a technical matter and Runcible was thorough. Marin was present, because by that point she attended most of the estate business meetings. She had been clear from early in the marriage that she intended to understand how the properties were managed, and Havenmore had been clear with equal lack of ceremony that she was welcome at any meeting that required the management of the estate, which was most of them. Runcible laid out the problem. There were 3 possible approaches: a legal challenge, a negotiated settlement, or a physical resolution that involved altering the relevant drainage infrastructure. There was a long discussion of the legal challenge. There was a long discussion of the negotiated settlement. Havenmore was in favor of the settlement on grounds of efficiency. Runcible was uncertain about the neighbor's willingness to settle on terms that were fair. Marin said, the physical resolution. Both men looked at her. She said, if the water rights are in dispute because of the drainage infrastructure, and the drainage infrastructure can be altered so that the dispute becomes moot, the physical resolution eliminates the problem rather than managing it. The legal challenge produces either a win or a loss, both of which set a precedent that may or may not be useful in future. The settlement produces an agreement that may or may not be honored. The physical resolution produces a fact that requires no further management. A pause. Runcible said, the cost of the infrastructure alteration is less than 2 years of the legal dispute, she said. I've had Pemberton run the numbers. Havenmore looked at her. She said, I asked him to run them last week when I read the background on the situation. The estimate is in the 3rd page of the supplementary materials. Runcible turned to the 3rd page of his supplementary materials. After a moment he said, that is a notably lower estimate than I had anticipated. She said, Pemberton has been managing the northern properties costs for 15 years. He knows the relevant contractors. Another pause. Havenmore said, the physical resolution. Runcible confirmed the approach. The meeting concluded. Runcible gathered his papers with the expression of a man who has had his meeting go a different direction than he had planned and is deciding how he feels about this. After he left, Havenmore said, looking at his desk, you ran the numbers last week. She said, I try to come to meetings with the relevant numbers. He said, you read the background on the situation before the meeting was scheduled. She said, the background materials have been in the estate office for a week. I read them when I saw them. He said, Marin. She looked at him. He said, thank you. She said, you're welcome, and went to find Pemberton about the infrastructure contracts. He sat at his desk for a moment after she left. Then he picked up his pen and went back to his work. I was in the corner of the study, trying to be unobtrusive, and I watched this exchange and thought about a man who had spent 10 years noticing that a woman was exceptional and had managed his noticing at a distance, and who was now discovering, in the close range of the thing, exactly how exceptional she was, and was still learning to receive it without managing it. He was getting better at receiving it. 3 incidents from the spring of the first year that I want to record because they seem to me to characterize the shape of the marriage. The first, he brought her a book. It was not a remarkable book, an account of estate management in the northern counties, practical rather than theoretical, written by a man who had clearly spent considerable time in actual fields. He had found it in a catalog and ordered it, and when it arrived, he brought it to the small sitting room where she was working and set it on the table beside her with. I thought this might be more useful than the theorist. She looked at the book and then at him. She said, "Thank you." She picked it up and began reading the introduction. He said, "I've marked 3 sections that I thought were particularly relevant to the Southfield question." She said, "I'll read those first." He said, "The 4th chapter is also interesting, though more theoretical than the rest." She said, "I'll read it critically." He said, "I thought you would," and left. It was, for them, a love scene. The second, she argued with him. This happened about 6 weeks into the marriage, over the question of the spring planting schedule on the home farm. He had a view about the rotation that was based on his father's practice and 20 years of watching it applied. She had a different view based on what she had read and what she had observed in the kitchen garden and 2 conversations she had had with the head farmer. He was not accustomed to being argued with on estate matters. His household staff had not argued with him, and his tenants had not argued with him and Pemberton, while occasionally offering an alternative perspective, did so with the diffidence of a man who understood the hierarchy. Marin did not offer an alternative perspective with diffidence. She offered it with the directness she brought to everything, backed up with specific evidence and a clear explanation of her reasoning. He argued back, she argued back. The argument went on for about 20 minutes, during which neither of them raised their voices, but both of them were quite precise about their views. At the end of it, he said, "The farmer's recommendation." She said, "He favors the alternative rotation, but was waiting to be asked." He said, "Then we'll put the question to him directly and follow his recommendation." She said, "Good." He said, "You might have said you'd spoken to the farmer earlier." She said, "I wanted to hear your reasoning first." A pause. He said, "Why?" She said, "Because I might have been wrong about the rotation, in which case your reasoning would have told me where, and because I wanted to understand the basis for your view before I offered a different one. It seemed more useful than stating a position without knowing what I was disagreeing with." He looked at her. She said, "Was that wrong?" He said, "No," he thought for a moment. "No, that was the correct approach." She said, "I thought so," and went to find the farmer. He stood in the estate office for a moment after she left, with the expression of a man discovering, for the first time, what it is like to be genuinely argued with by someone who is at least as intelligent as he is and considerably less deferential. Then he went to find Pemberton, with the expression, underneath the usual composure, of someone who has encountered a new and not entirely unwelcome experience. The 3rd incident is simpler. In April early morning, before the household was fully awake, I came downstairs for something, I have forgotten what, and passed the library door, which was slightly open. I could see through the gap. She was there in the chair by the window with a book. She was not reading it. She was looking out at the kitchen garden where the spring had just begun to be visible in the color of things. He was at his desk. He was writing. Neither of them was speaking. It was simply 2 people in a room in the early morning, each doing what they wanted to do in each other's company. I stood at the gap for a moment and looked at this. Then I went on with whatever I had come downstairs for, which I have long since forgotten, because the thing in the library at 6 in the morning in April seemed more worth remembering. There is one more thing I want to tell you before I tell you about the 2nd winter and the conversation we had by the fire. It happened in the autumn of the 1st year in October, when the anniversary of Havenmore's wife's death was approaching. He had always managed this time of year with particular care. Withdrawn slightly, more inward than usual, the grief brought closer to the surface by the season's change. I had been present for it every year for 15 years, and I knew its texture, and I gave him space, as I always had, and waited for it to pass. In the 1st year of the marriage, I was at Ashford Court for the anniversary, because I was there more often than not. On the evening of the anniversary itself, I was in the library reading. He did not come to the library that evening. Agnes told me later. She told me because I asked, and because she trusted me after 12 years, that Marin had gone to the study where he was spending the evening and had knocked and gone in at his word and had sat with him for 2 hours. She had not, Agnes understood, said very much. Neither had he. They had sat together in the study in the lamplight, and she had been there, and he had not been alone. He came to the library the following morning as though nothing particular had happened. He worked through the morning as he always did. He said nothing about the previous evening. But there was something different in him that autumn, something that resolved differently than it had in previous years, more quietly, with less of the particular weight that the anniversary usually carried for weeks before and after. The grief was still there. It would always be there, but the way he carried it was different. I thought about what it meant to have someone simply sit with you in the dark, without requiring you to explain or perform or be anything other than what you were in that moment. I thought about the fire built before it was asked for, and the tea adjusted without remark, and a woman who understood that sometimes the right kind of care is the kind that is simply present. The second winter. Christmas at Ashford Court, as always. The library, the brandy, the fire, the portraits of the dead dukes observing from the walls with their particular painted equanimity. Marin had gone to bed at 10. He had stayed to talk to me, which was our habit, and the brandy was very good, and the fire was warm, and we had reached the particular ease of men who have said most of the things there are to say to each other, and are therefore able to sit in comfortable silence when conversation runs thin. I said, "Do you regret the years?" He was quiet for a long time. The fire. The snow outside. "Yes and no," he said. "I regret the silence more than anything else. She carried the knowing of the debt for 2 years, she had worked it out as much as she could, and she was managing it alone because I had given her no way to do anything with the knowing except continue managing it. That was mine to give her. The right to know clearly, the permission to speak if she chose to, the ground under her feet that would have let her decide what to do with the truth. I gave her silence instead. I told myself it was consideration for her position, and it was, but it was also cowardice in a better coat. She forgave it, I said. She did, he said. That is the thing. She saw the shape of the fear under the management and she let it go. I did not expect that, or I expected it to be harder, perhaps more conditional. She simply saw what it was and said yes, and we moved forward. He looked at the fire. I asked her once, he said, what she had thought during those 2 years, when she knew about the debt but hadn't found me specifically and was managing the knowing. What did she say? I said. She said she had thought, if it is him, he is doing it because he wants to and not because he expects anything from me. She said she had decided to accept it in the spirit in which it appeared to be given as a gift, with no obligation, and to leave the question of who had given it alone unless something changed. A pause. And when something changed, I said. He said, when I asked her to marry me, she said she had thought. Here is the who, finally, and it is exactly who I thought it was. I said she knew from the beginning. She suspected, he said, but she trusted the spirit of the thing before she knew the letter of it. That is, he stopped. That is a quality I do not know the right word for. Trust, I said, or faith, perhaps, the willingness to receive a thing well before you know its full shape. He said, yes, that. We sat with the fire. Edmund, he said after a while. Yes. She brought me tea this morning. And here I will give you the full account, because I have given you parts of it and I want to give you the whole. He said she came in at 7:30. She set the tray, she poured the cup. I called her back from the door, I had been going to let her go, and then I called her back, and she came back and I said, sit with me for a few minutes. And she sat in the window chair and opened her book and I went back to my correspondence. A pause. We were there together, he said. In the library, in the morning, not because it was her function, not because it was anyone's obligation. Because I said sit with me and she sat. Because she wanted to be there, or if she didn't at the start, she did within a few minutes, I could tell. She settled into the chair and she was reading and I was working and the fire was going and the morning light was coming through the east windows the way it does in October, and we were there. He looked at the fire. That is the whole of what I wanted, he said. Not the dramatic thing, not the public thing, not the announcement, not the first moment in the corridor when she said yes. Those matter. But the whole of what I wanted under all of it was this. The ordinary morning, the room in the morning light, her there by choice because she wants to be there and me there and us both there together, not performing anything for anyone, just in the room. He paused. She served my morning tea for 10 years, he said. And now she brings it because it is Tuesday and she likes the mornings in the library, no obligation in it, No function. Simply her preference in the room where I am. That is everything. That is the whole of it. I said nothing. There was nothing to say that was adequate to what he had said. The snow came quietly against the windows. The fire settled. The door opened. Marin, in her dressing gown, lamp in hand, with the expression that I had come to love for its directness. A woman who has waited long enough and does not believe in waiting further than that. She said, "Callum." He rose without argument. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at me. Nothing in the look required speech. I raised my glass. He went out. The door closed. I sat in the empty room with the fire going low and the portraits looking down and the snow outside, and thought about 10 years of mornings and what they had made. I thought about the 4th year and a name used with a familiarity that surprised me. I thought about November of the 5th year and a physician called without announcement. I thought about the 6th year and an appointment confirmed before the presentation was half finished. I thought about the 7th year and a kitchen garden arranged to specifications he had selected himself on the eastern boundary of an estate he had been managing for 20 years. I thought about the 8th year and a man standing in the kitchen garden with his back to the house, watching a woman work in the herb rows with the look I recognized, because I had worn it myself once and knew exactly what it meant. I thought about the 9th year and a brother's debt cleared through an intermediary, and a fund established and waiting in April among the rosemary, and a woman who had a theory. I thought about the 10th year and 14 pages of a household guide with a paragraph about a lamp and a morning blend, and a bag packed, and a bag set down, and a door opened 2 inches in the east corridor, and one word given freely. How could a man like that, people ask me, be undone by a woman who poured his morning tea? He was not undone by it. He was found by it. Found one morning at a time across 10 years. Found by the fire built before he mentioned it was low. By the tea adjusted because the lamp burned late and someone was watching. By the care given at the maximum distance from any claim on it, given without announcement, given for its own sake, given in the language of someone who loves by attending to what is actually needed and quietly providing it. He had been finding her in return. The cottage and the debt and the fund and the physician and the appointment, all of it love given in the same language, at the same distance, in the only form he believed himself permitted. 2 people loving each other from opposite sides of a wall in the same language for 6 years, until the wall became untenable. And then the wall came down. Not dramatically, not with a great scene in a ballroom, with a bag set down at the bottom of a staircase and a name said without its title and one word given freely. And every morning since, she comes to the library in the morning because she wants to, because it is Tuesday and she likes the light in the library in the morning, and he looks up when she comes in, and they are there together, and it is entirely ordinary, and it is the whole world. The morning tea was never a small thing. It was, from the very first cup, everything. I have told you the story, but I have not told you enough of it. A story of this kind, assembled from a decade's accumulation of small things, owes it to those small things to be properly observed. Let me go back, then, and fill in what I have left out. I have not told you about the 8th year in detail. I have mentioned the kitchen garden the moment I caught him watching her. But I have not told you what happened in the months before that moment, or the months after, because those months are where the thing became irreversible. In the spring of the 8th year, Havenmore received a proposal of marriage. Not from Marin, from the world, in the form of his sister Frederica, who had been watching her brother manage his solitude for the better part of 10 years, and had decided that something ought to be done about it. She wrote to him from London in March with the particulars of a widow, young, well-bred, the daughter of a good family, recently freed from a marriage that had been entirely suitable and apparently entirely miserable, now at liberty and possessed of a social standing that made her acceptable and a personality that Frederica described, with the particular enthusiasm she reserved for projects she had decided were going to succeed, as refreshingly direct. Havenmore wrote back, with the same particular patience he brought to all of Frederica's projects, that he appreciated her concern, that the widow sounded like a perfectly estimable person, and that he was not in a position to consider a proposal at this time. Frederica wrote back to say that he was always not in a position to consider a proposal, and that she was beginning to wonder whether he was waiting for something that was not going to arrive, and that if he was, she would like to know what it was so she could assist. He did not reply to this letter. In April, he came to Ashford Court for the matter I have mentioned, the boundary dispute, and I found him in the kitchen garden, watching Marin work in the herb rose. The afternoon that followed was the one I have described. The study, the papers, dinner, and then, you ought to be careful. There is nothing to be careful of. But what I did not tell you about that dinner was the quality of his distraction throughout it. We had a good cook at Ashford Court, and the food was what it usually was, carefully prepared, properly presented. I ate. He ate, or moved food around his plate in ways that suggested eating. He made reasonable conversation when the occasion required it. He was not rude, and he was not absent in any way that would have been visible to anyone not watching closely. But I was watching closely. He was somewhere else entirely. His body was at the dinner table, managing the social mechanics of the meal with the automated competence of 20 years' practice. His mind, his actual attention, the thing he pointed at things when he was genuinely present, was somewhere else. I did not ask where. I did not need to. After dinner in the library, over brandy. "Frederica has written to you," I said. "Yes," he said. "About the widow." "Yes. And—" He looked at the fire, and nothing. I said, "Callum, Frederica is not wrong exactly in the concern. You are 42. You have been alone for 14 years. He said, "I am aware of that." I said, "The title requires an heir. You know that." He said, "I am aware of that as well." "And yet," I said. A long pause. He said, "And yet." I said, "And yet you are in the kitchen garden on a May afternoon watching a woman work in the herb rose." He looked at me. I said, "I know what I saw. You know what I saw. And I am telling you, as the person who has known you longest and most completely, that a man who looks at a woman the way you look at her does not need a widow from London, however estimable, however direct." He said, "Edmund." I said, "I know, I'll stop." I stopped. But I thought about it for the rest of the spring and into the summer, and in August I came back to Ashford Court, a different reason this time, something to do with a London legal matter that genuinely required his input, and I found him once again in the vicinity of wherever she was. In the morning room on Tuesday, the east sitting room on Friday evenings, the kitchen garden wall on his afternoon ride. I said nothing about it. I had said what I had to say. What he did with the saying was his. What he did in the 8th year was the fund. Not the fund as I have described it, established in the 9th year. Something earlier, a conversation with his solicitor that autumn, the documentation of which I found only later, which established the basic framework for the provision he eventually formalized in the 9th year. He was, in the 8th year, beginning to build the argument for it, thinking through the legalities, the appropriate amount, the terms that would give her genuine independence without any quality of obligation. He did this in writing, in the careful language of a man who thinks through problems on paper, and the papers found their way into the estate files where I eventually encountered them. He had been thinking about the fund since the 8th year. He did not formalize it until the 9th. He did not activate it until the 10th, when her notice arrived, and he needed to give her everything immediately. The planning of it in the 8th year was a kind of loving, slow and deliberate and utterly silent. I want to tell you about the 9th year's August. Not the April among the rosemary, which I have mentioned, the conversation where she told me about the debt, and I understood that she knew. August, when I was at Ashford Court on another invented pretext, and the house was in its particular summer fullness. It was a Saturday. The household had its particular Saturday energy, a day off for most of the junior staff, a slower rhythm in the kitchen and the corridors. Havenmore had ridden out in the morning and was not yet back. I was in the library with a book and the afternoon light. Marin came in to return some volumes she had borrowed. The library was hers to use. She had been borrowing from it since the 7th year, when Havenmore had told Pemberton to make the shelves available to senior household staff, a decision Pemberton had noted in the records with his customary neutrality, and I had noted in my understanding of the situation with considerably less neutrality. She put the volumes back with the organized care she brought to everything, checked their spines against some internal system of her own, and then stood for a moment looking at the shelf. Then she took a different volume down, looked at the spine, put it back, took another. I said, "Can I help you find something?" She turned, having not, I think, registered my presence in the far armchair. She said, "I beg your pardon, I didn't see you, Mr. Wexford." "Not at all," I said. "What are you looking for?" She looked at the volume in her hand. "Something on drainage engineering," she said. "There's a question about the kitchen garden's east border. The drainage needs adjusting, and I want to understand what I'm asking for before I speak to the gardeners about it." I said, "Third shelf on the south wall. There are 3 or 4 volumes there that should be relevant. The blue one with the broken spine is useless, but the one beside it is very good." She looked, she found the volumes. She stood in the afternoon light, reading the table of contents of the useful one with the focused attention she brought to things she was actually reading, head slightly tilted, one finger tracking along the index. She said without looking up, "Mr. Wexford." "Yes. May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Has His Grace been well?" She said it with the precise neutrality of someone who wants an honest answer, and is trying not to weight the question with expectation. "He is always well," I said, "or always appears so. You would know better than I would whether the appearance is accurate." A pause. She said, "He has been working later than usual this past month. The lamp is on past midnight most nights." "Have you adjusted the blend?" I said. A fractional pause. "Then, yes." "Good," I said. "I think he sleeps poorly in late summer. I have always thought so but never known enough about it to say so with certainty." She looked at the index. "It is not unusual for the parliamentary recess to produce additional estate demands." "No," I said, "not unusual." Another pause. She said, "He is very capable." I looked at her. She was still looking at the book. "He is," I said. "I mean," she said, with a quality in her voice that I had not heard from her before, careful and a little more unguarded than her usual. "He works very hard. He is very thorough. He keeps all of it in order, and he does it largely alone, and I think it costs him more than he shows." I said, "Yes, I think that is right." She put the volume under her arm. She said, "Thank you for the recommendation," and went out. I sat in the library for a while after she left. I thought about a housekeeper who notices that her employer is working past midnight most nights in late summer and adjusts his morning tea to help and wonders, in a conversation with his closest friend, whether the cost of the work is visible to anyone who is looking. I thought about a duke who has been quietly arranging a cottage and a fund, and the clearing of a debt for a woman who notices his late lamps and worries about the cost of his work. I thought, this is an extraordinary amount of care passing between 2 people who are pretending they are simply in the same house in a professional capacity. I thought, something is going to have to give eventually. In the 9th year, as autumn deepened, I was at Ashford Court for 2 consecutive weeks on the thinnest pretext I had yet managed, and I observed something I want to describe carefully, because it is one of the things I am most certain of. It was a Monday evening. Havenmore had been in the estate office with Pemberton all day, going through the winter preparations, the kind of thorough, comprehensive review that he conducted every autumn and that required Pemberton's full attention and a great deal of paper. I had not seen him since morning. At 6:30, he came to the library where I was reading and stood in the doorway for a moment. I said, "Long day." He said, "Yes." He went to the decanter and poured brandy without sitting down. He stood at the window with it, looking out at the kitchen garden. The light was almost gone, October past 6, the day ending, and the garden was gray in the dusk. I said nothing. He said, "She reorganized the cellar this afternoon." I said, "Did she?" "Pemberton mentioned it," he said. "She found an error in the wine inventory that had been accumulating for 3 years. The numbers were wrong. She corrected them and reorganized the storage to make the correct inventory easier to maintain." "That sounds useful," I said. "Pemberton said she spent 4 hours on it," he said, "on a Monday." "She is thorough," I said. "Yes," he said. He looked out at the darkening garden. "She didn't mention it to me." "Why would she?" I said. A pause. "She wouldn't," he said. "It is her domain. She manages it, she found a problem and she fixed it. That is exactly what she does." He looked at the garden. "She does not need to mention it to me." "No," I said. "She simply does the work," he said, Because it needs doing and she is the person responsible for doing it, and she does it well, and then she moves on to the next thing. Yes, I said. He said, I have known a great many people in my life who did not do that. I said, you have. Who required recognition or management, or whose work produced secondary effects that needed their own management. He paused. She simply does the work. I looked at him. He was still at the window, looking at the dark garden with the brandy in his hand. Edmund, he said without turning. Yes. I know what you think. Do you? I know what you have thought for some time. I said nothing. He said, you are not wrong. He finished his brandy. He set the glass on the windowsill. He said, I'll have Pemberton schedule a review of the wine inventory in the morning accounts. He went to his study. I sat in the library for a long time and thought, you are not wrong. He had said it, finally. Not in those words exactly, but clearly enough. He was not arguing with me about what I had been seeing. He was acknowledging it. The acknowledgement was not an action, but it was the first step toward one. I thought a year, perhaps 2. He will find his way to it eventually. He is not a man who moves quickly in the things that matter to him most, but he moves with complete conviction once he moves. I thought, I hope I am there to see it. I was. The conversation between Marin and Havenmore in the library on the Tuesday of the second week of the Vane's visit. The one about the lighter blend and the 3 years. I want to give you a fuller account of what I know of the days following it, because those days have a texture I think is important. He read the household guide. I have told you this. He read it for the whole of the morning, and I was in the room and I saw when he reached the paragraph about the lamp and the blend, and I saw the quality of his stillness change. He walked for 2 hours, he returned, he went to his study. The following morning, he came to the library at 7:30 and was at his desk before the tray arrived. When she came in, he said good morning in the tone he had been developing over the past year. Not the habitual formal acknowledgement, not the professional courtesy, but something with a register closer to what it actually was. She said, "Good morning, Your Grace," and set the tray. She was about to pour. He said, "The blend." She stopped. He said, "I want you to know that I am aware of it now, what you have been doing." She said, "Yes, I understood that yesterday." He said, "I wanted to say, it has made a difference. Not in a way I could have articulated before yesterday. But I notice now, looking back, that the mornings after a difficult night have been easier than I would have expected them to be. I had attributed that to other things." She said, "It is a small adjustment." He said, "Yes, but consistently made and correctly judged." A pause. She said, "It is only tea, Your Grace." He said, "Yes," another pause, "and yet." She poured the cup, she said it. She adjusted the small things on the tray. She said, "I will make sure Agnes has the instructions." He said, "I read the guide." She stopped. He said, "All of it, yesterday." A silence. She said, "I see." He said, "It is very thorough. I wanted Agnes to have everything she needs." "Yes," he said, "I could see that." Another silence, different in quality from the previous one. She said, "Is there anything else, Your Grace?" He said, "No, thank you, Miss Ashby." She withdrew. He sat at his desk and did not pick up his pen for some time. I was in the corner of the room, invisible in the particular way I had perfected over a decade of being present at things I was not supposed to witness, and I watched him sit at his desk with the morning tea beside him and the household guide open at the relevant page, and the morning light from the east windows doing the thing it did in October. He looked, I thought, like a man who has arrived at the limit of an argument he has been making with himself for a long time, and is standing at the limit and looking at what is on the other side, and trying to decide whether to cross. 3 days later he was in the kitchen garden, and I came and said what I said, and he said go away, and the crossing happened. I want to tell you about the morning after the engagement was confirmed. Not the evening of the confirmation itself. I have described that, the corridor and the east sitting room and the one word freely given. The morning after. I came down to the library at 8:30, later than usual. Havenmore was at his desk. He was not working. He was sitting at his desk with his hands in front of him and his coffee, not tea, He had taken coffee that morning, the first time in years that I had seen him deviate from the morning routine, and he was looking out the window at the kitchen garden. He heard me come in and said, without turning, "She has gone to the herb rose." I said, "Has she?" He said, "She went out at 8. She does that sometimes when she has something to think about, goes to the kitchen garden and works in the herb rose." I said, "I know." He said, "I know you know." A pause. "I went to find her at 8:45 last year in April. You were already there." I looked at him. "You came to the kitchen garden in April?" "Yes," still looking at the window. "I came too. I wanted to ask how the spring planting was going. I saw you speaking to her and turned around." I sat down in my armchair. "You turned around?" "Yes." I said, "Callum." He said, "I know." We sat for a moment. He said, "She is going to write to her brother this morning. She told me she would write to him before anything else, so he is not left waiting." "That is considerate," I said. "Yes," he said, that is characteristic of her." He looked at the kitchen garden for a while longer. Then he said, "I need to write to my solicitor." "About the fund," I said. "About the fund," he said, "and the cottage, and the activation of the provisions, and a letter to her brother that I have been putting off writing." "You should write the letter to the brother first," I said. He said, "I know." She said the same thing. "She is right." "She usually is." He picked up his pen. He set it down again. He said, "Edmund." "Yes." "Thank you." I said, "I did very little." "You said the things I needed someone to say," he said. "The kitchen garden last year, the things about the guide, the paragraph about the lamp. You said them at the right moment." I said, "You had already decided by the time I said them." He considered this. "Perhaps," he said, "but the saying helped." I said, "That is what friends are for." He looked at me. Then he picked up his pen and began to write the letter to the brother. I went back to my armchair and my book and the morning light. The morning of the wedding, before the ceremony. I want to tell you about this because it was one of the things I witnessed directly and have not yet described. I came downstairs at 8:30 to find Agnes in the entrance hall in a controlled state of organized urgency. She was managing the details of the morning with the competence that was always hers, coordinating the various elements. The flowers, the carriages, the household's particular responsibilities in a morning that was not quite like any other morning, with her usual quiet efficiency. She looked up when I came down and said, in the tone of someone managing too many things simultaneously to filter her directness, "The Duchess is in the small sitting room with her brother. Mrs. Marsh is with the children in the drawing room. His Grace is in the study. Pemberton is at the chapel." I said, "Has anyone taken him tea this morning?" She looked at me. I said, "Has anyone thought about whether he has eaten?" She said, "I have not thought about that." I said, "I'll go." I found the kitchen in the state that kitchens are in on mornings of occasions, organized chaos, very competent, everyone knowing exactly what they were doing. I asked for a tray and was provided one within 5 minutes. I took it to the study and knocked. Havenmore was at his desk. He was dressed for the ceremony, the formal dark coat, the white linen, the careful arrangement of a man who has paid attention to his appearance. He was not working. He was sitting at the desk with his hands flat on the surface, looking at the wall. I set the tray on the side table. He said, "Edmund." I said, "Eat something." He said, "I'm not hungry." I said, "Eat something anyway." He looked at the tray. He ate something, not much, but something. I sat in the chair across the desk and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that needed saying. After a while he said, "I have been afraid of a great many things in my life." "I know," I said. "This," he said, "is not one of them." I looked at him. "It should be," he said. "It should feel precarious or uncertain, or it is a very significant step, and I have not made one like it in many years, and by any reasonable assessment there should be some portion of fear involved." And I said. He said, "And there isn't. There is only I want to get there. I want the ceremony to be done and for her to have said the words and for us to have begun properly. That is all I feel. I want to get there." I said, "Then let's get there." He stood up. We walked to the chapel. The vain situation. I want to tell you more about Lady Constance because I think she deserves more than the brief space I have given her. She was, as I have said, genuinely intelligent, the kind of intelligence that makes itself felt not through speaking, but through seeing accurately and drawing correct conclusions. She had been brought to Ashford Court with a specific purpose, and she understood the purpose, and she had undertaken it with the composure of a woman who has been told what was expected of her and has decided to meet the expectation with dignity. Within the first 3 days, she had understood that the expectation was not going to be met, and she had adjusted to this with remarkable equanimity. I am certain of the 3 days because I happened to be in the corridor when she passed, and I caught, briefly, the expression on her face, not distress, not calculation, but the particular thoughtful quality of someone processing a revised understanding of their situation. On the 4th day, she was in the drawing room with her mother when I came through, and Lady Vane was speaking with animated optimism about the coming season and Frederica's plans and the general prospect of things. And Lady Constance was listening with the patient composure of a woman who has said what she thought needed saying and has no intention of repeating it. She caught my eye across the room briefly. There was something in the look that said, with perfect clarity and without a word, "We both know how this is going to go, and I think we are both all right with that." I gave her the smallest nod. She returned to listening to her mother. After the announcement, she sought me out as I have described. She said the things she said. She shook Havenmore's hand. She went to her carriage. But before she went out, before the carriage was announced, while the morning's business of departure was still underway, she paused beside Agnes Plym in the entrance hall. Agnes was seeing the family off with the organized efficiency she brought to all such occasions. I heard Lady Constance say quietly to Agnes, "She is going to be very good for him." Agnes said, with the restraint of someone who has been professional all morning and is nearly at the limit of it, "Yes, Your Grace." Lady Constance said, "He is very lucky." Agnes said, "He is." Lady Constance said, "I hope they are happy." And Agnes, whose restraint had been holding all morning against something considerable, said, in the voice of a woman who has made a decision, "They are going to be." I want to go back, briefly, to a much earlier moment. The 6th year, the day Havenmore confirmed Marin's appointment as head of the household staff. I have described the confirmation, the interruption of Pemberton's presentation, the name given before the full list was reviewed, the instruction confirmed with the patience of a decision already made. What I have not told you is what happened in the hour after Pemberton withdrew. Havenmore returned to his work. He was writing correspondence, estate matters, the usual material of a Tuesday morning at Ashford Court. About 40 minutes after Pemberton left, there was a knock at the library door. He said, "Come." Marin came in. She was carrying the household ledger she was responsible for at the time, the junior accounts book, the one she managed as part of her parlor duties. She set it on the side table and said, "I understand you've confirmed my appointment, Your Grace." He looked up from his work. "Yes." She said, "I wanted to thank you." He said, "The appointment is appropriate. You are the correct choice for the position." She said, "I know that," said it without apology, without qualification, a statement of accurate self-assessment. "I still wanted to thank you for making it." He looked at her. She said, "I will not disappoint you." He said, "I am aware of that." She said, "Good morning, Your Grace," and withdrew. He looked at the door for a moment after it closed. Then he looked at his correspondence. Then he picked up his pen and went back to work. I was in the far armchair. I had witnessed the whole exchange. I noted in my private accounting of such things 2 items. The complete absence of deference in her, I know that. The ownership of the accurate self-assessment without apology. And the quality of his "I am aware of that," which was not what you say to a person who is congratulating themselves unduly, but what you say to a person about whom you already know something with certainty. He had confirmed the appointment knowing she was the right choice. She had accepted it knowing she was the right choice. They had acknowledged this to each other with the directness of 2 people who respect truth above social convention. It was, in its own way, the most interesting professional exchange I had ever witnessed in this house. It was also, I now understood, one of the early moments in something much larger. I should tell you about Mrs. Hartley's retirement and what she said to me before she left for Bath, because it belongs to the story even though she could not have known it did. She had been the housekeeper at Ashford Court for 30 years when she retired, and she managed her retirement with the same organized thoroughness she had brought to everything else. Arranged the particulars with Pemberton, briefed her successor comprehensively, said her goodbyes to the staff individually and in order of seniority, and then sat down with me on her last evening in the small sitting room for the cup of tea that had been our occasional tradition across 20 years of Christmas visits. I asked her how she felt about going. She said, tired and glad of it and a little sad, which is the only honest answer. She looked at her teacup. She said, she will do well, you know. I said, Miss Ashby. Yes, she said. She has been ready for this for 2 years. I kept her in the parlor detail longer than I strictly needed to because I wanted to see how she handled difficulty before I trusted her with the whole house. She paused. She handles difficulty the way this house needs it handled, quietly, correctly, and without requiring anything from anyone else. I said, she is remarkable. She is very capable, said Mrs. Hartley. She had the tone of a woman who is about to say something she is not quite sure belongs to her to say, and is going to say it anyway because she is leaving and will not have another opportunity. She is the kind of person who notices things, not just household things. She noticed that Thomas the footman's mother was ill before Thomas mentioned it, and she arranged for him to have a day off to visit her. She noticed that the south wall of the walled garden was deteriorating before the undergardener spotted it, and she spoke to the head gardener before the winter set in. She notices the human things and the practical things together. I said, yes. She said, looking at her cup, she notices his grace. I was quiet. Mrs. Hartley said, I am an old woman who has been in other people's houses for 30 years and I have learned to see things. I will not say what I see, but I will say that she is the kind of person who is good for a house like this one and good for the kind of man who is in it. She finished her tea. That is all I will say, she said. I said, thank you, Mrs. Hartley. She said, good night, Mr. Wexford. She went to bed. I sat with her empty teacup and thought about the particular intelligence of a woman who has spent 30 years in a house watching what happens in it, and who has, in the space of that cup of tea, told me more clearly than I had yet managed to articulate to myself what was actually going on. Marin notices his grace, and Mrs. Hartley, who notices things, has noticed that. I thought, there it is. There is the shape of it. I had been watching it accumulate for 2 years, and now I had the language for it. I just did not yet know what was going to be done about it. The last scene I want to give you is one from the 3rd year of the marriage. It was a summer afternoon. August, the estate at its fullest. The kitchen garden producing with the abundance that Marin had over the preceding 2 years, significantly improved through a combination of drainage adjustments and planting rotation revisions. The house was warm and the library was too bright for reading in the afternoon, and I was in the kitchen garden with a book and a bench in the shade of the south wall. Havenmore came through the gate at 3:30. He had been out on the home farm since noon. He was in his outdoor clothes and looked, as he sometimes did in the summer, less the Duke of Havenmore and more simply a man who had spent the afternoon walking fields. He did not see me immediately. Marin was in the garden at the far end, near the herb rows, directing 2 of the kitchen garden staff in some project involving the late summer growth. She had her working dress on and her hair up in its habitual arrangement and a basket over her arm, and was, characteristically, entirely absorbed in what she was doing. He came through the gate and saw her. He stopped. I watched him from the shade of the south wall. He did not have his back to me this time. I could see his face. He watched her speak to the kitchen garden staff with the direct, unhurried authority of someone who knows exactly what she wants and is explaining it clearly. He watched her gesture toward the herb rows with the efficiency of someone for whom efficiency is a form of respect. He watched her take a cutting from one of the plants and examine it with the focused attention she brought to things she was actually examining. And the expression on his face was the expression I had seen in the chapel. The management was not exactly off. He was in a garden, not a public room, but there are degrees of composure and the habitual minimum was not entirely applied. What was visible underneath, it was the same thing that had been visible in the chapel. The complete, settled certainty of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be and knows it. She looked up from the cutting and saw him. She said, "You're back." He said, just now. She said, I thought you were back at 2. He said, the south boundary took longer than I expected. She said, did you find what you needed? He said, yes, walked toward her. How is the late herb growth? She said, better than last year. The drainage revision is holding. She handed him the cutting. He looked at it with the genuine interest of a man who has learned, over 3 years, to care about the things his wife cares about. I'm going to extend the planting by about 6 feet next spring. He said, is that feasible with the current irrigation? She said, we would need to extend the channel along the east wall. I've asked the head gardener for an estimate. He said, good. He gave her back the cutting. She put it in her basket. They stood in the kitchen garden in the August afternoon with the sun on the old brick walls and the herbs smelling the way they do in summer, and the 2 kitchen garden staff waiting at a respectful distance for the instruction to continue. He said quietly, I thought about the south boundary question all morning. She said, and? He said, and I think you were right. The physical approach is better than the legal one. She said, I thought you agreed with me at the time. He said, I did. I was confirming it after a morning of thinking about it. She said, you don't need to think about it for a morning after you agree with me. You can simply agree and proceed. He said, I prefer to confirm my agreements by thinking about them. She said, that is not the most efficient approach. He said, no. She gave him a look that contained, in its particular quality, both an acknowledgement that he was right and a mild objection to his being right in exactly this way. Then she turned back to the kitchen garden staff and gave the instruction she had been interrupted in giving. He walked past me on the way back to the house. He saw me in the shade of the south wall with my book. He said, Edmund. I said, Callum. He said, without changing pace, she was right about the south boundary. I said, I know. He went inside. I sat with my book in the shade of the south wall and looked at the kitchen garden and thought about the 8th year, when I had stood at the corridor window and watched him watch her in exactly this space, and all the years before and after that moment, and everything the years had made. The kitchen garden was the same garden. The herb rows were the same rows, better for her management of them. The old brick wall was the same wall. The afternoon light was the same light. He was not the same man who had watched from a distance. She was not the same woman who had been watched. They were, both of them, entirely themselves, perhaps more entirely themselves than they had been in any year before, and they were in the same space, and it was easy between them in the way that things become easy when the difficult part is finally behind you. The difficult part had been 10 years. The easy part, the ordinary part, the daily part, the mornings in the library and the afternoons in the kitchen garden, and the evenings with the accounts and the occasional argument about south boundary drainage approaches. The ordinary part was just beginning. It would last, I hoped, for a very long time. I believed it would. I still do. So, how could a man like that be undone by a woman who poured his morning tea? He was not undone by it. Let me say that one more time clearly. He was found by it. Found by the care taken without announcement, the fire built for a man not yet in the room, the blend adjusted because the lamp burned late and someone noticed, the 12 words written in a household guide for a successor. He does not request an adjustment, and is not aware that one is made, that distilled 10 years of quiet attention into a single paragraph that told the truth about everything. And he had been finding her in return, in the only form he believed himself permitted. The cottage and the debt and the fund and the physician in November, all of it anonymous, all of it careful, all of it given without his name attached. Both of them loving in the same language, from opposite sides of a line that neither of them felt permitted to cross. Until she picked up a bag to go to Hertfordshire, and the line became untenable. Until she set the bag down. Until he said her name without the miss. Until she said his without the grace. And every morning since. The library in the morning light and the tea and the 2 of them there together, not because it is required, but because she wants to be there, because it is Tuesday and she likes the mornings in the library, because she has always liked them, and now she is permitted to say so. That is the morning tea. That is what it was from the first cup all along. Everything. I want to tell you about the years themselves, the texture of them, which I have described in outline but not in the detail they deserve. A decade is not a single thing. A decade is 10 separate years, each with its own character, its own small turning points, its own accumulation of evidence that I was watching something I did not yet have a name for. Let me go through them. The first year, 1803 to 1804. She arrived in October, as I have said, and I have told you what I observed that first December. What I have not told you about the first year is what happened in the spring of 1804, when Havenmore came to Ashford Court for the usual survey of the home farm. This was not a Christmas visit. He came for 3 days in March, which was unusual. He typically confined his spring visits to the estate steward and rarely made the journey himself. He said it was the question of the south field drainage. I believe it was. I also believe that the south field drainage was one reason, and that he was not fully aware of the other. She was new to the house still. She had been there 6 months. She was a parlor maid and no particular reason for him to notice. But I was staying at Ashford Court for February and into March that year, managing a land dispute for a neighboring client, and I was there when he arrived, and I observed the 3 days. He did not interact with her specifically. He was at Ashford Court for the South Field, and the South Field was what occupied him. But on the second evening, in the library after dinner, I said something about the new staff member, the one who had replaced the previous parlor maid who had left to marry, and he said, without looking up from his reading, "The Ashby girl." I said, "Is that her name?" He said, "Miss Ashby. She has been here since October." He turned a page. He knew her name. He knew the month she had arrived. I said, "She seems competent." He said, "Very," and said nothing further. I sat with this observation and made nothing of it. It was March 1804. He was 40 years old, and the youngest and most recently arrived parlor maid was a distant professional concern at most. There was nothing to make of it. I did not stop making something of it for 3 months. The second year, 1804 to 1805. In the second year, she was moved to the parlor service generally, not specifically assigned to the library detail yet, but managing more rooms, more responsibility. I observed it at Christmas and thought, that is a rapid advancement for a girl who has been here 14 months. I asked Mrs. Hartley about it in passing. Mrs. Hartley said, "She is suited to the work." I said, "In what way?" She said, "She does not need to be told the same thing twice. She does not need to be told things that she should be able to work out from what she has already been told. She notices what the room requires, and she provides it without waiting to be asked." A pause. She is the kind of person who makes a room better simply by being responsible for it. I said, "That is high praise." Mrs. Hartley said, "It is accurate description." She went back to the household accounts. I went back to the library and watched Havenmore read, and thought about a woman who makes a room better simply by being responsible for it, and about a man who had known her name and the month of her arrival in March of the previous year. I thought I should not make assumptions. I made assumptions anyway. The third year, 1805 to 1806. This was the year of the assignment, the year she became the Duke's personal household attendant during his stays at the court. Mrs. Hartley made this decision in the spring, 6 months before the Christmas visit that would bring it into effect. She told Pemberton. Pemberton noted it in the records. I learned of it from Pemberton in October, reviewing the seasonal arrangements. I asked why Miss Ashby specifically. Pemberton said, "Mrs. Hartley believes she is best suited to the role." I said, "What role?" He said, "The management of the library detail and the Duke's morning routine during his residence. The previous girl startled too easily. Miss Ashby does not startle." I said, "That seems like a low threshold for selection." He said, "It is the relevant threshold for this particular position." And he was right. The relevant threshold for managing Havenmore's mornings was not being flustered by him, and most people were flustered by him. By the composure, the authority, the particular quality of his attention when he directed it at you, which was the attention of a man who expected things to be correct and would notice immediately if they were not. She was not flustered. I observed the first week of the new arrangement in December of the third year, and I watched her move through the library with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who has considered the environment and decided what it requires. She was not performing ease. She was not pretending not to be in the room with a duke. She was simply in the room with a duke, managing the room the way it needed to be managed. He worked, she moved. The room was quiet. On the Thursday of that first week, she knocked and entered, and he was not at his desk. He was at the window, looking out at the park, which he sometimes did in the mid-morning when something in the work was not resolving itself the way he wanted. She set the tray, built the fire, and was withdrawing when he said, without turning from the window, "Leave the second cup." She said, of course. She left it. He did not immediately come to his desk. She had left the second cup for later. When he finally did sit down and reach for it, I saw him note briefly that it was still warm. She had left it in the right place on the tray to stay warm, and then returned to his work without comment. Small, nearly invisible, and yet. The cup had been left in the right place, by a woman who had considered how long he was likely to stand at the window, and had made the calculation accordingly. I had started paying attention. The fourth year, 1806 to 1807. I have described the fourth year at length. The fire built for a man not yet in the room. The name used with familiarity. The observation that something was changing, or had perhaps already changed, in the quality of his stillness when she was present. What I want to add to what I have already said about the fourth year is a specific conversation. It happened in January of 1807, technically the fourth year of the arrangement, the fourth Christmas and its aftermath. He had stayed at Ashford Court longer than usual, through the first week of January, which was not his habit. He typically departed before the new year. On the last evening, he and I were in the library, as we usually were, and I said, "You are staying later than usual." He said, "There are some account matters to review with Pemberton." I said, "The accounts have been there for months. Pemberton reviewed them thoroughly before your arrival." A pause. He said, "There are additional matters." I said, "Are there?" He said, "Yes." He said this with the tone of a man who has decided that the conversation is over. I let it be over. But I thought about it for the rest of the evening and into the night, and on the coach back to London 2 days later. There were additional matters. What additional matters could there be at Ashford Court in January that had not presented themselves at any other time of year, and that required his personal attendance? I thought of the particular brightness of the January mornings at Ashford Court, the way the frost on the park made everything sharp and exact, the particular quality of the library in the first weeks of the year, when the light was thin and cold, and came through the east windows at an angle that made the room feel like a held breath. I thought, he is here because he is not ready to go, and I cannot fully account for why he is not ready to go by reference to the accounts. I said nothing to anyone. I filed it under, "I am probably imagining this," and I went on not imagining it for another 6 years. The fifth year, 1807 to 1808. I have described the physician in November. I want to add one thing. When she returned to duty in December and came to the library on the first morning, she said, "Good morning, Your Grace." He looked up from his desk. He said, "Good morning, Miss Ashby," and then, "I am glad you have recovered." This was 4 words more than he had said to any returning staff member in all the years I had been at Ashford Court. "I am glad you have recovered. Not, you are back. Not the fire, please. I am glad you have recovered." 4 words that crossed from the professional into something that was at minimum neighborly and was at most, well, 4 words. She said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and poured the tea. He went back to his correspondence. I went back to my book. I thought about 4 words for a week. The 6th year, 1808 to 1809. The year of the appointment. I have described this. I want to tell you about the evening before Pemberton brought the list of candidates. Havenmore and I were in the library. Mrs. Hartley's notice had come in the spring. It was now August, and the question of the appointment had been sitting in the administrative queue for 3 months. He said, out of the blue in the middle of a silence, "The housekeeper's position." I was reading. I lowered the book. "Yes. I have been considering it." And he was at his desk, turning a pen in his hands, not writing, not reading, simply turning the pen. The household requires someone who understands how this particular establishment functions. Not in the general sense, in the specific sense. Someone who has been here long enough to know what this house requires and what the people in it require. I said, "That is not a small pool of candidates." He said, "It is smaller than Pemberton's list will suggest." I said, "Do you have someone in mind?" He said, "Pemberton will bring the names tomorrow." He set down the pen. He picked up his reading and said no more. I looked at him for a moment. He appeared absorbed in his reading. I went back to my book. The following morning, Pemberton brought the names. Havenmore confirmed the appointment before the first candidate's qualifications were half presented. He was neither surprised by his own decision nor in any hurry to pretend otherwise. He had decided before the meeting. He had decided when he said, "The household requires someone who has been here long enough to know what this house requires." He was telling me the answer before he was supposed to give it. I thought about this for a month. The 7th year, 1809 to 1810. The year of the cottage. I have described this fully, the kitchen garden, the specification, Pemberton's careful neutrality. What I want to add is a small thing. In December of the 7th year, during the Christmas visit, she was passing through the entrance hall when he was leaving for a morning ride, and they happened to be in the hall at the same moment, not unusual. But the timing was such that he held the door briefly while she passed through first with a pile of linen bound for the upstairs cupboards. He held the door. She said, "Thank you, Your Grace." He said, "Of course." And then he waited another moment before following her out, as though he had been going to say something else and had decided against it. I saw it from the staircase. I saw him pause with his hand on the door frame and then not say whatever he had been going to say and go out instead. What he had been going to say, I do not know. I will never know. But I noted the moment and added it to the accumulation. The 8th year, 1810 to 1811. The kitchen garden in May, the boundary dispute. I have described this. What I want to add is the journey back. I drove back to London from Ashford Court in June of the 8th year, and I spent the journey thinking about what I had seen, and what I had seen for 7 years before that, and what the shape of it added up to. A man who knew a parlor maid's name and arrival date in March of her 1st year. A man who thanked her when he thanked no one. Who said good morning when he said good morning to no one. Who sent a physician in November and called it the estate providing for its people. Who confirmed an appointment before the meeting began. Who renovated a cottage and arranged its kitchen garden and had not told her it existed. Who stood in the kitchen garden on a May afternoon watching a woman work in the herb rows with a look that I had worn myself once, a long time ago, and knew exactly for what it was. I had been, I thought, a fool for 7 years about what I was watching. Not in the sense of having been wrong about any individual observation. In the sense of having told myself about each individual observation that I was probably imagining things, when the observations had been accumulating for 7 years into something that was undeniable. He was in love with her. He had been in love with her for years. He had been managing the fact of it from the maximum possible distance, in the only form he believed he was permitted, and he had been calling it management. And she and I had not yet that June begun to think about her side of it, but I was about to start. The summer of the 8th year, London. I was in town for the rest of the summer, and I did not see Marin, and I thought about her. I thought about what it meant to be Marin Ashby in Havenmore's household, to be the person responsible for the management of his mornings, to have spent 5 years in that role, to be precise and professional and good at the job, to have been promoted twice into greater responsibility, to have had a physician sent when she was ill at the estate's expense with no explanation, to have been confirmed in the appointment of head of household before the meeting began, to have been given in each of these things something that went slightly beyond the professional, wrapped in a professional form, to have been noticed repeatedly and specifically in ways that were not quite explicable by the demands of the employer-employee relationship. What did she make of it? What could she make of it? She was a woman of 25, 26, working for a duke. The power differential was absolute. Whatever she observed, whatever she suspected, whatever she might have felt in return, and I was beginning to suspect she felt something in return, she could not act on it. She could not speak. She could not acknowledge. She could only do her work with the same quality she had always brought to it, and notice and manage the noticing and go on. The same line. From the other side. Both of them, I thought, alone with the same thing. Both of them providing for each other from across a distance, neither of them felt permitted to cross. I came back to Ashford Court in October, as I have described. I sat in the kitchen garden with Marin in April, and she told me about the debt, and she said, "I have a theory." And I understood that she had been right. She was managing the same thing he was managing from the other side of the same line. And something in me decided, that autumn, that it was not going to be allowed to continue indefinitely. Not because I was going to interfere. I am not a man who interferes in other people's love affairs. But I was going to be present. I was going to remain present. And when the moment came when something could be said that might matter, I was going to say it. The 9th year, 1811 to 1812. I have told you about the 9th year in some detail, the brother's debt, the fund, the conversation in the library in November when I told him I knew everything and he did not deny it. What I have not told you is a particular afternoon in October of the 9th year when I was sitting in the library, and she came in to return a volume and stayed for 20 minutes. This was not the conversation I have described, the one about the drainage engineering and his grace working late. That was August. This was October, and it was different. She came in with the volume, replaced it, turned to go, and then paused in the doorway. She said, "Mr. Wexford." I said, "Yes." "May I ask you something impertinent?" I said, "You may try." She looked at the door for a moment, as though making a decision. Then she turned back into the room and sat in the chair across from me, not the armchair by the fire, the working chair, the one she sometimes sat in when we had talked before, the chair of someone who intends a real conversation. She said, "Why does he stay?" I said, "Pardon." She said, "At Ashford Court. He stays longer than he used to. He comes more frequently. He finds reasons, the accounts, the boundary dispute, the farm survey, and the reasons are real, but they are also reasons that could be managed by correspondence or by Pemberton." A pause. "Why does he stay?" I looked at her. She looked back at me with the steady gray eyes. I said, "Why do you ask?" She said, "Because I am trying to understand something and I cannot understand it from inside it. I need the outside view. And you are the outside view that I trust." I sat for a moment with this. I said, "What are you trying to understand?" She said, "Whether I am imagining things." I said, "What things?" She said, "The physician in the 5th year, the appointment, the debt." A pause, the way he says good morning. I looked at the fire, I looked at her. I said, "You are not imagining things." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I see." She rose, she smoothed her dress. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Wexford, that is useful to know." She went out. I sat in the library for a long time after she left and thought about what I had just done, and whether it was the right thing, and whether it changed anything. I thought, I have confirmed what she suspected. I have not told her anything she did not already know. I have simply told her she was right to know it. I thought, the question is whether being confirmed in the right to know it changes what she does with the knowing. It did not immediately change what she did. She went on managing the knowing in the same way she had been managing it for another year. She gave her notice in the 10th year. But I have thought about that conversation many times since. I have thought about it because when she set the bag down and said, "Yes, Callum," the yes was not the yes of a woman who has been waiting years in doubt. It was the yes of a woman who had known what there was to know and had been waiting for him to cross the line himself, and had set the bag down because she was not going to cross it for him. She was not imagining things, I had told her, and she had known exactly what not imagining things meant, and she had done nothing with it except wait. The patience of it astounds me when I think about it. She waited for 6 years with confirmed knowledge and made no move and gave no sign. She waited because she had decided that the move had to be his, that the crossing had to be his, and she was not going to take it from him. That is a quality I have no adequate word for. Patience is not it. Patience suggests passivity. She was not passive. She was present and working and noticing and providing and writing 14 pages of a household guide with a paragraph about a lamp and a morning blend. She was doing everything that was hers to do. She simply would not cross the line he had not yet crossed. And in the end, he crossed it. And she had known he would. The 10th year, 1812 to 1813. What I have not yet fully described about the 10 days between her notice and the evening in the east sitting room is the quality of the house. A house knows when something is happening in it. I know that is not quite literally true. But there is a quality that comes over a household when something significant is pending, a held breath, a particular care in the performance of ordinary things, a kind of collective awareness that the situation is not ordinary. The staff of Ashford Court knew, I believe, in those 10 days. Not specifically, not in any defined sense, but in the way that people who live in close proximity to a complicated situation develop an instinct for its weather. Agnes Plym moved through those 10 days with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that the best thing she can contribute is to make everything work as smoothly as possible and not call attention to anything that does not require attention. Pemberton managed the household paperwork with his usual meticulous care, but with a kind of additional precision, as though making sure that everything was in perfect order was a contribution he could make to whatever was happening. Old Hewson came in from the kitchen garden more than was strictly necessary to deliver produce. Each time he came, he managed to pass through the corridor where Marin was working and say something brief and practical and entirely without any emotional content, which was Hewson's way of checking on her. The house breathed carefully for 10 days. And then the evening happened, and the corridor and the east sitting room and the one word freely given, and the house exhaled. I know it was not literally so, but I know what I heard at breakfast the following morning. Agnes's voice in the kitchen, efficient and warm, and with an undertone of something that had been relieved of a very long tension. The sound of Pemberton going about his work with a quality that was marginally less guarded than it had been for weeks. The sound, from the kitchen garden, of Hewson whistling something tuneless and contented. The house knew, and it was glad. There are a few more things I want to say about the years after. In the 3rd year of the marriage, in the winter, I came down with a chest cold that kept me at Ashford Court for 3 weeks past my planned departure. I was ill and confined to my rooms for the first week, and Marin managed my care with the same thorough attention she gave everything. She sent up what was needed, arranged for the local physician to call twice, made sure the room was warm without being stifling, and appeared herself on the 4th day to ask, directly and practically, how I was and what I required. I said I required company, mostly, and she sat for an hour and talked to me about the drainage revision, and the Northfield's changed management, and the current state of the wine cellar. None of which I cared about at all, but all of which was tremendously entertaining coming from her, because she had opinions about everything, and expressed them with characteristic directness and occasional sharp wit that I had suspected was there for years, and that she deployed more freely now than she had as a housekeeper. After an hour she said she had things to see to, and I was probably well enough to manage without her for a few hours, which was entirely true, and was also, I thought, the kind of sentence that has been prepared in advance by someone who has enjoyed the company more than she intended to, and is now departing at a sensible moment rather than staying too long. She went. I lay in my sick room and thought, this is a remarkable woman. I have thought so for 11 years, but it continues to be true with more specificity each year. He came to see me that evening. He came and sat in the chair by my bed and said nothing for a while, which was his way of providing company. I said, your wife is very good at looking after people. He said, yes. I said, she told me about the drainage revision. He said, she has views about the drainage revision. I said, strong ones. He said, she usually does. A pause. I said, you are a lucky man. He said, I know. He said it quietly, with the quality he had when he was being entirely serious, not as a social response, not as the habitual understatement that was his social mode, but as a straightforward statement of something he believed completely. He knew. I thought he has known for a long time. That is the particular sadness and the particular gift of the whole long story. That he knew, and that knowing it, he arranged a cottage and cleared a debt and established a fund and waited 6 years to say so. And she knew, and knowing it, she adjusted his morning tea and wrote 14 pages and waited 6 years for him to say so, and they were both right about each other the whole time. The knowing was never in doubt. The saying was the hard part. The saying is always the hard part. One final thing, the last scene I want to give you. In the autumn of the 2nd year of the marriage, a Saturday in October, the estate at its most beautiful, the light, the particular gold of an English October that has no equivalent in any other season or country. I went for a walk through the kitchen garden and the east path and came, eventually, to the eastern boundary of the estate. I walked along the eastern path until I came to Larkspur Cottage. Hewson was in the garden. He was cutting back the herb rose for the autumn, the same kind of work that Marin used to do in the kitchen garden behind the house. He was old and methodical and entirely at peace with what he was doing. His wife was in the window, looking out at him with a cup of tea. I stood at the gate for a moment, watching this. Hewson saw me. He came to the gate. He said, "Mr. Wexford." I said, "Mr. Hewson, the cottage looks very well." He said, "It does. She chose well." He meant Marin. He said she with the specificity of someone for whom the pronoun refers to one particular person, unambiguously. I said, "She always does." He looked at the cottage and the herb rose and the window where his wife sat. He said, "There is only one thing better than a good house." I said, "What is that?" He said, "When the right people are in it." He went back to his herb rose. I walked back along the eastern path to the house. Havenmore was in the library when I returned, at his desk, writing. She was in the window chair, reading in the afternoon light. They were not speaking. They did not need to speak. They were simply in the room, each doing what they wanted to do in each other's company, and the room had the quality that good rooms have when the right people are in them. Complete. I stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked up. He saw me. He made a small gesture toward the armchair by the fire, the gesture of a man who has been inviting the same person to sit in the same chair for 20 years and sees no reason to stop. I sat down. She looked up from her book. She said, "Tea." I said, "Please." She went to find it. He went back to his writing. The afternoon light came through the east windows in the particular way it had in October, thin and gold and clear. The fire was going. The room was exactly what it had always been. And it was entirely different. And it was entirely enough. That is the story, all of it now. Everything I know and everything I saw and everything I was told in the years after it was over and done and settled. She poured his morning tea for 10 years. And then she was his wife. And she still brings the tea on Tuesday mornings because she wants to, and he looks up when she comes in, and they are in the room together, and it is ordinary, and it is everything. The morning tea was never a small thing. It was, from the very first cup, everything. Everything. I have been thinking, as I finish writing this account, about the question of what love looks like when it cannot say its own name. It looks, I think, like a fire built before anyone mentions it is low. It looks like a physician called without announcement, and a debt cleared through an intermediary, and a cottage renovated to specifications chosen by the wrong person. It looks like a morning blend adjusted because a lamp burned late, and the adjustment made without remark, and the instruction written down for a successor, so the adjustment would continue after the giver was gone. It looks like 6 years of Tuesday mornings in an adjacent room, and Friday evenings in the east sitting room while accounts were reviewed in the corridor, and afternoon rides past the kitchen garden wall. It looks, in other words, like everything that had been passing between these two people for a decade, in both directions, in silence. What I have tried to give you in this account is not a grand love story. There is no ballroom. There is no dramatic revelation before an assembled crowd. There is no public moment of claiming. There is a library and a fire and a cup of tea and two people who noticed each other from the beginning and found every possible way to take care of each other for 10 years before they found the words. That is not a lesser kind of love story. I think it may be a greater one. Because the love that arranges a kitchen garden for someone who has not been told it exists, the love that adjusts a morning blend for a man who is not aware the adjustment is being made, this love does not require an audience. It does not require recognition. It requires only the person and the noticing and the giving of what is needed. It is, in other words, the kind of love that trusts the other person to be worth loving even when there is nothing to be gained from the loving. That is what I watched for 10 years. That is what I want you to understand about it. I want to tell you one more thing about Marin. Not about her relationship with Havenmore. About her relationship with the house itself, which was always, I think, partly where she loved him, in the management of the things that surrounded him, in the care of the environment he lived in. She was not sentimental about the house in the way that people who have not managed houses tend to be sentimental about them. She did not speak about Ashford Court as though it were a person or a dream. She spoke about it the way a craftsperson speaks about their medium, with direct attention to its properties, its requirements, its particular resistances and opportunities. The east wall needs pointing before spring, she would say, and point it before spring. The coal cellar arrangement is inefficient, she reorganized it. The kitchen garden's drainage has been wrong for 20 years, she fixed it. She managed the house the way she managed everything, by understanding it completely and then acting on the understanding without excess. But I also saw, occasionally, something underneath the management. A moment in the kitchen garden when she straightened up from the herb rows and looked at the old brick wall in the autumn light with an expression that was something other than professional. The way she paused, sometimes, in the library doorway before entering, as though registering the room itself before she committed to being in it. The way she said, once, in the 3rd year of the marriage, when Havenmore asked her what she thought ought to be done about the East Wing's damp problem. I think the East Wing has been waiting for someone to pay attention to it for a long time. He said, "Have you been paying attention to it?" She said, "Since about the 7th year." He said, "And what do you recommend?" She said, "I recommend we start from the foundation and work up. The foundation is where the problem starts." He said, "That will take the better part of a year." She said, "Yes, but it will last 50 years. He said, "Do it." She did it. The East Wing was properly repaired over the following winter and spring, starting from the foundation, and it has been dry since. But what I thought about, when I remembered that conversation, was the 7th year. She had been paying attention to the East Wing's damp problem since the 7th year. She had been head of the household for 1 year at that point. She had noticed the problem, diagnosed it correctly, understood the solution, and held the knowledge for 6 years because the solution required an expenditure that a housekeeper did not authorize, and a conversation she did not initiate. When she was in a position to initiate it, she initiated it, within the 1st year of the marriage. 6 years of knowing exactly what the foundation needed. And when the time was right, do it. Start from the foundation, work up. It will take a year, but it will last 50. I have thought about that sentence many times. I want to tell you about Havenmore in the 1st year after the wedding, because I watched him and I want to record what I observed. He was a different man. I want to say that plainly without sentiment. He was a different man than the one I had known for 20 years, and the difference was not dramatic. He was still himself, still Havenmore, still the composed and formidable figure who had always occupied this particular corner of the peerage. But the composure was not doing the same work it had always done. It had always been, for as long as I had known him, a kind of armor. Not dishonest armor. He was not performing composure over a different inner self. He was genuinely composed, genuinely controlled, genuinely in command of his own responses in a way that most people are not. But the composure had been maintained, I now understood, partly against something, against the awareness of loss, against the management of a feeling he could not name, against the long maintenance of a distance that cost him something every single day. In the 1st year after the wedding, the composure was still there, but it was not maintaining itself against anything. It was simply how he was. And without the weight of what it had been maintaining, it looked different, lighter, I suppose. More like a temperament than a discipline. He laughed more than he had. Not loudly, not often, but occasionally at things she said. She had a dry wit that I had glimpsed before, but that she had been careful with as a housekeeper, and which she was considerably less careful with as his wife. She made observations about people and situations with the directness she brought to everything, and occasionally the observations were funny, and he laughed at them. She laughed at him too, occasionally. Not meanly, she had no meanness in her, but with the affectionate precision of someone who sees a person completely and finds them fundamentally charming even in their absurdities. She laughed at his preference for confirming his own agreements by thinking about them. She laughed at the way he could spend an hour on a letter that could have been written in 5 minutes, because every word had to be exactly right. She laughed at his relationship with his morning coffee when he deviated from the tea, which was a relationship of deep ambivalence. She laughed, and he watched her laugh with the expression I had seen on his face in the chapel, and then he smiled, not the small social smile that was his public mode, but the real one, the one I had seen perhaps a dozen times in 20 years, and they went on with whatever they were doing. I watched this and thought, this is what was behind the composure. This is what the management was maintaining at such cost. A man who, when the right person was in the room, had a smile that changed the quality of his face entirely. He had kept that smile very carefully for a very long time. She had it now. The final thing I want to say is about endings, or rather, about the thing that is not quite an ending. Love stories are supposed to end at the wedding. The narrative logic of them says, here is the obstacle, here is the overcoming, here is the arrival at the destination, and now we close the book. What I have been trying to tell you in this account is that the wedding was not the end. The wedding was the beginning of the ordinary part, which is the part that matters most. The ordinary part is the library in the morning. The ordinary part is the argument about the South Field rotation. The ordinary part is the estate manager coming to Ashford Court with a problem and leaving with a solution he did not plan for. The ordinary part is October in the 3rd year of the marriage, in the kitchen garden, with the light on the old brick walls and the herbs in their late summer fullness, and 2 people talking about drainage without performing anything for anyone. The ordinary part is Tuesday mornings, and the tea and the window chair and a book. The ordinary part is entirely ordinary, and it is the whole of the thing. This is what Havenmore said to me in different words in the second winter. It is entirely ordinary, and it is everything I have. And he was right, and I want to put it on record that he was right, because it is the kind of rightness that is not always said clearly enough. The grand moments matter. The courage of the ask matters. The one word freely given matters. The chapel in November and the composure that came off and the hands clasped and the old words said with the specific gravity of 2 people who mean them completely, all of that matters. But it matters because of what comes after. The ordinary morning, the ordinary afternoon in the kitchen garden, the ordinary evening in the library, 2 people in the room, each doing what they want to do in each other's company. That is the love story. That is all love stories if they go well. And this one went well. After 10 years of mornings and 6 years of managing the same thing from opposite sides of the same line, and 1 bag set down and 1 word given, it went well. She brings the tea on Tuesday mornings because she wants to. He looks up when she comes in. They are in the room together. It is entirely ordinary. And it is the whole world. And it was always going to be the whole world from the very first cup. She just had to set the bag down first. And he just had to ask. One scene I have not given you is from the 2nd year of her time at Ashford Court, the 2nd Christmas, when she was already in the parlor service and had begun to settle into the particular way the house ran. It was an evening in January, after the Christmas visit had formally concluded. Havenmore had stayed later than usual. There was always some reason, the accounts, the tenancies, the particular condition of the South Field. I was in the library with my book. He was at his desk. She came to collect the tray at 8:30, which was later than usual, because he had worked later than usual, and she had waited. He said, as she lifted the tray, "The accounts are more complicated than I anticipated." She said, "I'm sorry to hear that, Your Grace." He said, "It is not a problem that cannot be resolved. It is merely one that requires more time than I had allocated." She said, "I'll leave the fire banked in case you work into the evening." He said, "That is not necessary." She said, "It is no trouble," and left. That night the fire was banked, and he worked until midnight and the library was warm. I know this because I came down at 11 to get something I had forgotten, and I saw the light under the library door, and I noted that the fire was still going, and I went back to bed. In the morning she came at 7:30, and the blend was lighter. He did not comment on it. There was no reason to comment on it. There was nothing to comment on. She had simply made the right adjustment for the morning and set the cup and gone about the rest of the day. It was the 2nd year. There were 8 more years of this. From the 3rd year, a winter afternoon. I was in the library. He was working. She came in not for the tray, but for a household matter, something she needed to confirm with Pemberton, and Pemberton was with Havenmore at the time. She waited at the door, and then Pemberton left, and she was about to follow. Havenmore said without looking up, "A moment." She stopped. He said, "The linen you ordered for the east bedrooms. The quality is better than what we had." She said, I changed suppliers. The previous supplier's quality had been declining. The new one costs slightly more, but the difference in durability should make it more economical over time. He said, how long have you been considering this change? She said, since August. I did the cost comparison in October. He said, and you did not consult me because... The household linen is within my management remit, she said. It did not require your involvement. A pause. He said, no, it didn't. Another pause. He said, but I would be interested in the analysis if you have it written up. She said, I can have it on your desk tomorrow morning. He said, thank you. She went out. He went back to his desk. He was looking at his work, but I could see that his attention had not immediately returned to it. He sat for a moment with the quality of a man who has just had a conversation that went somewhere he did not quite expect. Then he shook it off and returned to the correspondence. I went back to my book and added the moment to the accumulation. From the 9th year, a morning in May. I was at Ashford Court on the usual invented pretext. The morning was fine, which was unusual for May in the English North, and the household was at the quiet business-like activity of a May morning before the summer began to complicate things. I came down to the library at 8:30, later than usual, and found the room empty, no Havenmore at his desk, no morning tray. The fire was going but had been banked rather than built up, which meant the room had been arranged for later in the day. I went looking for Havenmore and found him in the kitchen garden. He was not watching her this time. He was standing near the kitchen garden door with a sheaf of papers, clearly on his way somewhere, and he had stopped because she had said something that had stopped him. I could not hear what they were saying from the corridor window. I could see them. She was pointing at something in the herb rows, some matter of planting, some practical concern, and she was speaking with the direct, absorbed attention she gave to things she was actually thinking about. He was looking at where she was pointing, then at her face, then at the document he had in his hands. He said something, she said something. He looked at his papers and then at the herb rows again. He said something else. She looked at the herb rows with the expression of someone running a calculation, not a numerical one, something more spatial, about how things fit together. Then she said something and made a gesture that indicated a different configuration. He nodded once. She gave a direction to the undergardener, who had been waiting at a respectful distance. Then she turned back to Havenmore and said something that ended the conversation. He went on out the gate with his papers. She went back to the herb rows. I stood at the corridor window and thought, they are beginning to have working conversations, about the estate, about the actual management of things. In the kitchen garden spontaneously because they were both there and the question was there. This was the 9th year, before the notice, before the bag was packed. They were already, in some way I had not fully registered, partners in the management of this place. The romantic declaration, when it came, was not a beginning. It was a recognition of something that had been true for years. That, I thought, is important to understand about it. She was already woven into the fabric of Ashford Court, not as a housekeeper, not as an employee, but as someone whose knowledge and judgment and care had become part of how the place ran. He had been consulting her, informally and without acknowledgement, for years. The morning when she said yes was the morning that the informality became formal, the unacknowledged became acknowledged, the without his name on it finally had his name on it. The rest was the form. The substance had been there a long time. One last scene from after, the second spring. I was walking in the kitchen garden. It was April, the herbs coming back, the garden resuming after the winter, when I came across both of them there at the same time, which was not unusual but which I had not anticipated. They were crouched at the far end of the herb rows, looking at something close to the ground. She was pointing at something small, some matter of growth or damage or spring recovery that required close attention. He was looking at what she was pointing at with genuine interest. She said something, he said something. She said something else and picked up a cutting and held it where he could see the particular thing she was talking about. He took it, examined it, gave it back. She put it in her basket. They stood up, he brushed the earth from his knee. She adjusted her basket. She said something that made him smile, the real smile, the one that changed his face. He said something in reply. She said something that might have been a mild objection. He said something else that must have been more satisfactory because she nodded and moved on to the next row. He followed, looking at the next row as she pointed out whatever required attention there. They went through the herb rows together. Two people in a garden in April, looking at what the garden needed and deciding what to do about it, in each other's company, without performance. I watched from the south wall. This is what 10 years made, I thought. This is the ordinary, this is everything. I went back inside, because the library was waiting, and the fire, and the morning was going on, and there was nothing further that needed to be witnessed. There are things that are better observed than recorded. But I recorded it anyway. Because that is the story, all of it. And it deserves to be recorded. I should tell you, while I have the space and the occasion, about a Christmas that I have not described. The Christmas of the 6th year, the first Christmas of Marin's tenure as head of the household. This was the year that things changed most visibly in the management of the house, because she was now managing the whole of it rather than one detail of it, and the change was immediate and comprehensive. The household ran better. Not dramatically better. It had always run well under Mrs. Hartley, but better in the particular way that the management of someone who sees the whole picture differs from the management of someone who sees their portion of it. She saw the whole picture, and from the whole picture she drew implications and efficiencies and adjustments that accumulated into something noticeably different within 3 months. Pemberton noticed. He mentioned it to me in his characteristically measured way. The Ashby appointment appears to be working well. I said, yes, it does, he said. The household accounts have already shown some improvement. I said, I am not surprised. He said, nor am I, as it happens. High praise from Pemberton. But what I want to tell you about that Christmas is not the professional improvement. It is an evening. The 22nd of December. Havenmore had arrived the previous day and was already deep in the year's accounts. I was in the library. The household was in the particular busy quiet of a December in a great house. Preparations, arrivals, the organized activity of a large establishment getting ready for the season. At 7:30, she came to the library with the evening tray. Not the morning tray, the evening one, which was usually managed by a footman. She had brought it herself, which was not unusual for a new housekeeper making sure things were done correctly, but which was also not strictly necessary for someone who was already managing the house with complete efficiency. She set it with her usual care. She poured. He said without looking up, Miss Ashby. She stopped. He said, the household arrangements this week have been very well managed. She said, thank you, Your Grace. He said, the preparations for the season appear to be considerably ahead of where they usually are at this stage. She said, I reorganized the planning schedule in October. It allows more time for the things that cannot be rushed. He said, yes, I noticed. A pause. He said, it is appreciated. She said, I'm glad. And then, after a fractional pause that I believe she had not planned, is there anything else you need this evening? He said, no, thank you. She withdrew. He sat at his desk and did not immediately return to the accounts. I saw the particular quality of his not immediately returning, the beat or two in which the room has just changed and is settling back. Then he went back to the accounts. I went back to my book. I thought it is appreciated. 2 words, the same quality as good morning in December of the 5th year. A small departure from the usual mode that means nothing in isolation and means a great deal as part of a pattern. I was accumulating the pattern. I have been accumulating it for 6 years now, I thought. I wonder how many more years it will take. It took 4 more. The 2nd year of the marriage, late summer. This is the last thing I want to record. We were all 3 in the library in the late afternoon, Havenmore at his desk, Marin in the window chair, I in the armchair by the fire. We had been there for perhaps an hour. No one had spoken much. We were each doing what we were doing in the same room in the particular ease of people who are comfortable with the silence between them. She looked up from her book. She said, to no one in particular, I have been trying to remember when I first knew. He looked up, I looked up. She said, when I first understood what it was between us. She said this matter-of-factly, the way she said everything, with no self-consciousness about it. I have been trying to work out the exact moment. He set down his pen. She said, I think it was the physician. The 5th year. He said that early. She said, I didn't know it was you. I had a theory. A pause. But the theory told me something about the feeling, even without the name attached to it. I knew that someone who would send a physician quietly without expectation of gratitude, simply because I was ill, was someone who saw me. She looked at the window. And I knew that being seen in that particular way meant something. He was quiet. She said, I decided then that whoever had done it deserved to be assumed well of, and I decided to leave the question alone. He said, for 8 years. She said, for 8 years. She went back to her book. It was not difficult, it was simply what the situation called for. I sat in my armchair by the fire and thought, not difficult. 8 years and the knowing and the management of the knowing, and she says, it was not difficult. She is, I thought, for what is probably the 100th time in this account, a remarkable woman. She looked up again. She said, Edmund. I said, yes. She said, thank you. I said, for what? She said, for the kitchen garden in April, the 9th year, when I asked if I was imagining things. I looked at her. She said, it helped, knowing I wasn't imagining it. It helped to know that someone else could see what I was seeing. I said, I am glad it helped. She said, it did. She went back to her book. He was looking at her with the expression I had seen in the chapel. I went back to my book. The fire made its small sounds. The afternoon light shifted in the windows. We were in the room together. And it was entirely ordinary. And it was entirely enough.